Hey, David, are you on the line?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, do you want to allow the video for you and me, or how does that?
Yeah. Um, you should be able to start your video now.
Okay. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Unfortunately, I have to stand here to really make it work, but I'll
Okay.
try to stand here. I just can't see the screen from this part. Is this too close?
No, it looks okay.
Looks okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. And you look fine there.
Okay.
Um, and what else do we need to do to get started? Oh, who's running the slides? You, me, Roman?
I think you were going to, or
Okay.
you.
Yeah, let me run the slides. You sent me new slides. All right, let me download them.
Yeah. And we have, so there are participants who already joined, just so you know.
Okay.
But,
Who wants to be the introductory person before we get started? Do you want to? Would you like me to be that person?
I can do that.
Okay, just to greet everyone. Make sure to give everyone rules of the road. Like, are you able to turn off? Are you able to turn off the chat if it goes south, for example?
I'm not sure about that. Um,
Okay. What happens if we get Zoom bombed? You know.
that I'm not sure of either. Just kind of hoping that
Okay,
doesn't
so
happen.
I would just give an introduction to say, hey, is Meredith involved? Mer, what's that?
I mean,
It didn't ask me for a password on mine. I don't know. Yeah. Is Roman in there? You were not able to log in at all? Can you resend it to Roman? At the worst case, we do here. What does this look like? I guess we just switch. Should I move to the other office? Because here it's a bedroom, so it's kind of okay. So I'm okay. Let me go over there, Roman. David, can you still hear me?
yeah.
I'm on Wi-Fi, so if my computer dies for some reason, you'll have to take over, okay?
Okay.
So you might want to have the slides up just in the background. Are you able to join or no? Is it better there? Okay, David, it's a minute. Are you ready to get started or?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready. We have, I guess about 55 people who have joined so far.
Okay. Do you have the email list of participants, or is that Meredith who has that?
I have that.
Okay, so if for some reason you need to email everyone because someone Zoom bombed,
Okay.
then you can tell them that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the order is going to be you'll begin the introductions, and then I think Roman is going to go, and then I'll have something, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Sounds good.
Roman, do you want to? Yeah, but you're after David.
Okay. So I'm ready whenever you want to share your screen and bring the slides up. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the workshop for integrating the hierarchical taxonomy into psychopathology into clinical practice. And we're really excited to have everyone here today and have a wonderful lineup of speakers to talk about how to use the principles from HiTOP in clinical practice. And I'm going to go over some of kind of the ground rules and the schedule today, and then turn it over to Camilo and Roman to give an introduction to HiTOP. So if you could please advance the slide, Camilo. Okay. Camilo, if you're there, could you please advance the slide? Okay, well, we're going to start this morning with a HiTOP overview from Roman Kotov from Stony Brook University and Camilo Ruggiero from the University of North Texas and me. And we're going to talk about how to understand the HiTOP model and relevant evidence. And then we're going to discuss benefits and limitations of prevailing diagnostic systems and compare and contrast categorical and dimensional nosologies. Then after a short break, we'll hear from Len Sims from the State University of New York at Buffalo and Catherine Jonas from Stony Brook University, who will talk about scales and instruments and protocols that are consistent with the HiTOP model. And we'll talk specifically about scale interpretations. Then after another short break, we'll hear from Leanna Clark from Notre Dame University and Brady Nelson from Stony Brook University. And they'll talk about integrating the HiTOP perspective, so this dimensional and hierarchical perspective, into case conceptualizations. They'll talk about distinguishing the role of traits and symptoms and how to provide feedback from a HiTOP perspective in a way that can improve client insight and improve the therapeutic alliance. So Camille, could you please advance the slide again? Okay, and then tomorrow in the morning, I should note all of these times are Eastern time. In the morning tomorrow, we'll hear from Stephanie Mullins-Sweat, who will talk from Oklahoma State University, and Chris Hopwood from the University of Zurich, who will talk about how to incorporate HiTOP into treatment planning. So how to identify empirically supported treatments across these spectra and levels of HiTOP, how to develop treatment goals and intervention based on the profiles, and how to monitor and adjust treatment based on feedback from the HiTOP monitoring with HiTOP consistent scales. And then the last talk will be from Craig Rodriguez-Sayas from the University of Michigan, who will talk about working with diverse and underserved populations. In particular, factors that impact the applicability of the HiTOP model for underrepresented groups, as well as contextual multicultural factors that impact scores, how to develop individualized case conceptualizations with a focus on context through identity intersectionality, and then how to recognize the importance of being mindful about stigma and how it may manifest cognitively and behaviorally across cultural minorities. And each of the presenters throughout the workshop today and tomorrow will save some time at the end of their presentation for questions. With this many participants, it's difficult to do that verbally. So we're asking everyone to enter their questions either through the chat or through the Q&A feature. And I will monitor those and make sure that the presenters are aware of them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Camilo and Roman to talk about an introduction to the high-top model. You're muted, Roman.
Okay, now I am unmuted. Thank you, David. So, folks, if I only, all right, there it goes. All right, so this will be a review for most, but I think still important information for us to cover quickly. So the whole impetus for creation of HiTOP consortium was that enhance HiTOP model was that the existing manuals, diagnostic manuals, have several serious limitations. They are categorical in nature, yet empirical research indicates that none of them are true categories. When we look at latent structure, time again and again, we find continuous distributions with no zone of rarity between pathology and normality. And this categorical approach has been argued for as improving communication. It's easier to use the dimensions, it is thought, but in fact, if you properly use DSM, you have more than 300 categories to consider, and typically a given patient gets assigned multiple codes, multiple comorbid diagnosis, which becomes actually quite complicated. DSM-5, to its credit, has been aiming to address some of these issues, such as including dimensional ratings of personality and symptoms in section 3, also, which is sort of the appendix, but it also has some dimensional ratings in substance use disorders, intellectual disabilities. So progress is made, but most of codes, most of the diagnoses are still categorical. And there is also a problem of heterogeneity that, just to illustrate it on one disorder, in schizophrenia, there are 5 criteria, and there are 2 of which are required for diagnosis. There are 85 ways to meet the criteria for diagnosis of schizophrenia. So basically, you have 2 patients with this diagnosis who don't have a single symptom in common. This wouldn't be a problem if the symptoms were actually equivalent. So it doesn't so much matter whether that's symptom 1 or symptom 2. In fact, they're quite unrelated. So in data actually from our sample, a large first admission sample with psychiatric disorders, we have correlations that range from negative to small positive, meaning that this diagnosis of schizophrenia captures people who are very different from each other. That's true for many diagnoses, of course. And then comorbidity, that is occurrence of different diagnoses, is quite rampant in clinical samples. It is for a given diagnosis, between 2/3 to 100% are comorbid with of cases are comorbid with something else. And in community samples, situation is no better, that 80% of all diagnoses assigned are comorbid with something else. And these patterns are not random. For example, major depressive disorder, basically 60% of people with major depressive disorder have anxiety disorder, which is a lot higher than you expect by chance. The specifically odds of anxiety disorder are basically 4.2. But when we look at the relationship between major depressive disorder and substance use disorder, it's also increased, but 2-fold as opposed to 4-fold. And so we could use these patterns of comorbidity to identify optimal organization of psychopathology. More about that later. So in summary, we seen in diagnostic manuals proliferations of diagnosis from 100 back in the days of early editions of DSM to 300 to now potentially 450 if you count various subtypes, etc. And nonetheless, not otherwise specified remains one of the most common diagnoses, most common in some categories, such as eating disorder or psychiatric disorders. It doesn't tell us very much, besides perhaps a cardinal symptom. Yet, despite this catch-all category being overly relied on, we still have numerous subthreshold cases. That is, cases of patients presenting or clients presenting for treatment, and we don't have diagnosis for them. And the catch here, and this goes back to the whole categorical model not being good fit to the data, is that if we will try to capture the subthreshold cases by increasing the number of diagnoses, we likely would also increase comorbidity. And if you are really worried about comorbidity and wanted to decrease the number of diagnoses, then we would increase heterogeneity within each group. It's sort of an unsolvable problem. And so HighTop addresses this by first taking a hierarchical approach that incorporates comorbidity in it. It doesn't, it's not a surprise. It actually does patterns, say, of major depressive disorder with anxiety disorders and substance use disorders. It uses this information to organize psychopathology hierarchically. Then it integrates also traits and states, that is symptoms. Both types of constructs are included. And because syndromes are decomposed, as you will see, into more specific, tightly knit empirically derived dimensions, then the resulting phenotypes, we can call them diagnosis, but in dimensional framework, are more precise, more kind of more accurate and informative. And the way we get there in HighTop model is by using kind of construct validation process. That is, start using statistical methods such as factor analysis to organize symptoms such that similar symptoms are together, different symptoms are in different constructs, thus both increasing homogeneity of constructs and distinction between them. That's what we get. This is sort of a basic summary. It is not showing the details. First, we have DSM at the bottom and its disorders. They're not in HighTop model. No, rather, we decompose them into the symptoms, into the traits, and then we take those, organize them into this tightly knit homogeneous symptom components and maladaptive traits. Those are put together in syndromes, which are bigger constellations. Syndromes are put together, for example, like a panic attack. Symptoms are put together into larger subfactors and spectra and superspectra, such as P factor or general psychopathology factors. So here, let's just talk about the spectra, the 6 at the very top, to illustrate, because going through the entire model will take a very long time. So internalizing dimension captures depression, anxiety, sexual and eating problems. The basic thrust of it is that this is tendency to experience negative emotions that are either very intense or prolonged. And then thought disorder includes psychiatric disorders, eccentricity, disorganized behavior at various levels of intensity, not necessarily frank psychosis. So that's that disconnection, that's poor reality testing and related disorganized behavior. In detachment, we have lack of interest in social relationships, poor expressivity can manifest as negative symptoms of schizophrenia, for example, but also less intense manifestations, say in schizoid personality disorder. Disinhibited externalizing has its compound term in recognition that it is closely related to antagonistic externalizing. They, in fact, form this externalizing superspectrum together. But this inhibited part is primarily reflects kind of emphasis on short-term rewards over long-term consequences. And that includes various attention problems and the inability to control and regulate one's behavior, sometimes leading to substance use, sometimes leading to other negative consequences. So antagonistic involves very aversive interpersonal behavior, lack of empathy, callousness, etc. And finally, some other form is exaggerated, irrational, and concerns about one's health. So there, that's we stop as a summary, but just to say that we can go to much more refined levels, including levels of syndromes and components where we have in the neighborhood of 100 constructs. There is still work to be done, and we are in the midst of doing it, to determining how many of these constructs are actually empirically distinct. You know, the number of candidates was about 160, but we don't think 160 are actually distinct from each other. So we'll probably end up with about 100 on that level. All right, so let me turn it over to Camilo, who will talk about the rest, starting with measures.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Roman, for that introduction, and good morning to everyone on this bright Friday morning. So I want to talk a little bit about integrating HiTOP into practice. Later today and tomorrow, you're going to have presentations from really some amazing academic clinicians, and they're going to go into a lot more detail about treatment and how you can think about integrating treatment. They will be using case examples. They will be using different measures. And so please stay for those talks. I'm just going to give kind of a brief thoughts, and these are my own, about what kind of HiTOP measures are available, as well as how you can start thinking about HiTOP in treatment. So HiTOP, the consortium, has spent the last few years developing a self-report measure, and this is almost finalized. I think the idea is to release it in early 2023. And this is HiTOP self-report 1.0. This is a work in progress. It will not be the final measure, but it's one that they've spent a lot of time, work groups all over the country, all over the world, working on to develop this measure. So it should be a fairly interesting measure. It'll be a free measure, and everyone who's on this call will be the first to know about its release once that becomes public. But for now, the consortium doesn't have its own measure, and so there are many HiTOP compatible measures. HiTOP in many ways is not particularly new. It's something that's been around since, the ideas behind HiTOP have been around since at least the 1930s. And there are many HiTOP compatible systems and measures out there that think about psychopathology in this dimensional hierarchical framework. ACEBA, for example, is probably one of the more well-developed ones, but there are many others out there. And if you go to our website, you can find measures that we consider HiTOP compatible, consistent with the ideas behind HiTOP, and that are very different than, say, something like the SCID or DSM. The HiTOP Clinical Translation Work Group developed its own, wanted to create a free measure. So we created what we call the HiTOP DAT, but this is really just an assembly of measures that tries to capture the breadth of the HiTOP model as it was first presented. And so this measure that I believe Len Sims will talk in more depth about some of these measures, as well as Catherine Jonas, has a lot of different pieces to it. Probably the most important parts would be the CAP-PD and the IDIS, and it captures a lot of the different components of the HiTOP model. I'm not going to get into detail about them now, but just to put that on your radar. And the HiTOP DAT is free. We'll make this available to you afterwards if you like. It produces something like this. This is a graphical presentation. And here what you have, for example, is the internalizing scales that are part of the HiTOP DAT, as well as mania. And as you can see, this looks different from what we think about when we have a SCID diagnosis. Here you have different scales, and we convert them into T-scores, comparing a person's score to a normed population. And so immediately you can begin to get a lot more detail about specific symptom components that are elevated for a person. Here would be the other, let's see here. Here would be the other scales that are part of the HiTOP DAP. So general considerations when you're thinking about treatment, and I think Len Sims will go into this in more detail, as well as Stephanie Milne-Sweat and others, is that when you're thinking about interpreting this kind of HiTOP scale, you really need to think about what the reports you get back as hypotheses that need to be checked against other data. The measures that we're using that are HiTOP compatible are not the truth. They are simply hypotheses that, as any good clinician needs to verify against interview, against history, against reason for referral. And the validity of the profiles is always really important to make sure that when someone is endorsing certain items on a scale, that you make sure that that's a valid endorsement and is reflecting psychopathology as opposed to something else. And then after, when one gets a HiTOP scale, typically you would then integrate that description and interpretation with characteristics of whatever model you might be using. If you're CBT oriented, you would integrate the assessment into your CBT thinking of the client and where to take treatment. When I think about HiTOP and treatment, I think about 3 general treatment approaches, and this is just my own kind of thoughts on this. The first is this idea of thinking about overall formulation and treatment of symptoms. That HiTOP really helps you shift away from the kind of DSM, categorical thinking of a disorder, to thinking about overall formulation and treatment of symptoms. Sorry. Okay. So 3 different kind of approaches to thinking about it. And so when you start doing that, you know, the main core parts of HiTOP is that you move away from categories. So it's got to be 5 of 9 symptoms to have depression, but instead you start thinking about dimensions and interpreting T-scores. You also think about symptoms hierarchically instead of thinking about them as unrelated, and you start thinking about interrelationships of psychopathology, different kinds of. This kind of shift in conceptualization at a broad level allows you to think, you know, to target your treatment. You can think broadly about treatments that target psychopathology broadly, something like the unified protocol, or you can think about very narrowly focused treatments, something like sleep restriction for insomnia. So HiTOP, I think, empowers clinicians to kind of do what clinicians have been doing for a long time anyway, which is, you know, titrating where they treat. Is it a broad issue or a very narrowly focused issue that you want to focus on? And this, you know, as psychologists, Wampold and older meta-analyses he did, looked at common factors versus specific factors. And as any good clinician knows, common factors are a really important part of treatment. The alliance you have, the empathy you have, the ability to set goals. And you can think about HiTOP as these sort of common factors happening at just kind of a broader level of intervention. But you can also think about having very specific factors to treat narrow aspects of psychopathology. You can also think about things like remoralization affecting a higher, broader level. That when remoralization happens in therapy, for example, it might happen at the broadest level of psychopathology. So these are just different ways to begin thinking about it. Later today, I'm hoping that with case examples, you'll get into much more specific examples of how this might work in treatment, what it looks like. I just want to kind of introduce it. The other second sort of idea between of HiTOP is when you're thinking about treatment is that you can have very specific treatments. Like I said, behavioral activation for distress or anhedonia, sleep restriction for insomnia. And we've in the HiTOP group have been doing a lot of work to think about how can we target specific treatments. And I'm because of the brevity of the time today, I'm not going to get into this too much. And then the last sort of way that I think about HiTOP treatment is to think about tailoring matching treatments to components and traits. So for example, you can think about different patients coming in with depression and whether or not to use CBT or medication. We know that there's a little bit of evidence that for some clients, CBT might work better than for others based on traits such as like neuroticism. And so you can think about tailoring based on the specific profiles you get. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and not get into too much of the weeds there because I think that time is potentially short. And at this point, turn it back over to David, who I think has been monitoring the chat. And I want to open this up for some questions and some housekeeping. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, that's correct. So we've, a couple of things that I forgot to mention at the beginning is that if you haven't filled out the pre-survey that I sent out on Wednesday, and some of you registered after Wednesday may have not received that the first time, I just sent out another link to that, and I'll also put it in the chat in just a minute. So please fill that out, ideally before we get too far into the workshop. So I think we're gonna try to cut that off at 9 a.m. Central Time, so 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And there were a couple questions that in the chat and in the Q&A. The first being, how long do you anticipate the high-top SR will take for someone to complete?
I can comment on that since of our small group developing it, I don't think we have anyone else here on. The length of current instrument, and it is going to get shorter, is about 700 items. So it will probably going to get to 450 thereabout. That's a research version. So that's something that is not ready for clinical use, but will be ready by the end of this calendar year, another 2 months, if for use in a research protocol where it would take close to an hour. Now, it can be used in modular fashion, so you may be only interested in internalizing, and that will take like 18 minutes, let's say, or you may be only interested in externalizing antagonism and disinhibition, like 25 minutes, etc. Now, once we have clinical version, that is norms, validity scales, that would be a year from now potentially. So again, we are looking at something in the neighborhood of an hour, probably less, and also measurizable, but we don't have that yet.
And another question in the chat is, why is asexuality included in the high-top model?
Asexuality refers to lack of libido, effectively. This is like the question is this within domain of psychopathology? And that, I think, gets at fundamental question of what is the psychopathology. And I don't personally think that I can answer that in a way that it's a philosophical question. Personally, I'm not a philosopher. I go with the data in the sense that what goes together with other skills of psychopathology, what goes together with poor functional outcomes, we consider, and that sort of doesn't mean that people scoring on a relatively high on a given scale, first of all, form a group that is qualitatively distinct from the rest, that warrants a distinct label. Rather, it indicates a dimension of difference between people that can be clinically informative. So we're not. That's where we benefit from breaking away from categorical definitions, where people put in the beans and given labels with unfortunate consequences of stigmatization. We talk about dimensions that we all share, and we have a different sort of a degree of predisposition, and we also vary from day to day in terms of having good days and bad days in terms of our psychological functioning. And they are only probabilistically related to real world consequences, such as unemployment or not having fulfilling relationships, etc. And so I would say high-top profile by itself is perfect, even elevated, is perfectly compatible with adaptive functioning. So by itself, having high levels of high-top constructs is not the full diagnosis. You do want to assess real-world functioning. You do want to assess participants' own concerns. And if there is, let's say, elevation on reality distortion, things like hallucinations, delusions, perhaps even to frank intensity, but the person is happy with the delusions and it's not getting them in any kind of trouble. That may not be a target of treatment whatsoever, but maybe an information for you to have in mind. So let me underscore here that we may have some constructs that may sound wonky. They may also have to have constructs that, how to say this, that do not mean what they sound like, because one word doesn't capture them all. But the fundamental point is that this is the dimensions of individual difference as opposed to categories, as opposed to necessarily psychopathology.
There's a similar question in the chat about adaptive traits. And so have there been any thoughts about a high top model for adaptive traits or including it in the existing model?
We are aiming to talk about psychopathology. And what that practically speaking means is that we're interested in distinguishing people who are very high on a given trait, let's call it that, a versus moderately high versus slightly elevated. And so that means that basically we are not really assessing well like 85% of variance in the general population, let's say on something like detachment. And that's a sort of tactical limitation in a way that if we did, we would have to have much longer measures. And so this is not, I think, philosophical position. This is not something that is set in stone. The opportunities for further development of the opposite end of these measures. You can get some information about somebody functioning or having very good psychological functioning by scoring very low on height-up scales, but really they will not be very precise at the low end, at the adaptive end. So if you're really serious about adaptive functioning, about protective factors, that we want to do further measure development. So that's an invitation for everyone who's interested to sort of take perhaps height-up SR and maybe height-up model overall as a starting point and get into that other adaptive end of the constructs.
Will the high top SR include protocol validity indicators? And if so, could you describe those?
Yes. We don't have a plan worked out yet, so I unfortunately cannot say anything with confidence today. If your headline seems in person, I think he'd have a couple of ideas, but I don't know what Len is thinking.
Is the high top questionnaire, or will the high top questionnaire be available in Portuguese? And maybe you could just talk a little bit more about plans for translation into other languages as well.
So the measure development group decided to have a subgroup of people interested in adapting height-up SR and other resulting instruments, but height-up SR is a one that nearest to completion in to other cultures. That involves adapting it to different languages, but not only. And the group has not met yet, has not laid out the protocol because we're still working on finishing height-up SR self-report. Once we done that in the next couple of months, that will be next big item on the agenda. I cannot say with confidence what the protocol will be for the measure development, but I would say that I'm pretty sure it will be more than just translating and back translating the instrument, just because we know that results in many problematic items. And sometimes the problems are so significant you can't even, it's not like you're not measuring construct particularly reliably. You're not even measuring the right construct. That happens much more rarely, but it can happen. And so I think this process will involve some level of data collection. So to take a HYDA-PSR and bring it to a new culture will not be a matter of weeks or even a couple of months. It will be probably a matter of months, many months, but the specific protocol will be coming, I hope, in the beginning of next year, 2023.
And what about a version for children and adolescents?
It's, to me, the same kind of question, that the way that translating or adapting instrument to a different culture, to a different language potentially is the same sort of challenge as to adapting to a different socio-demographic group. So, for example, or selecting age-appropriate items, if in some ways is similar to taking an item that is right now written in English and expressing it in Portuguese. Conceptual challenges, psychometric challenges are there, and we cannot simply assume that we can swap one kind of behavior for another behavior and it will work. We would have to test it psychometrically. So that will be a charge of this adaptations group, I think, to go to basically to youth samples, but we will need more people, more participants in this process that we have now. Pretty much everyone who worked on HYDA-PSR really is specialist in adult psychopathology. So if you're a specialist in adolescent or childhood psychopathology, I hope you'll join the process, perhaps even lead some of this adaptation.
And I think that this is a topic that I think Dr. Nelson is going to cover in a little bit, but just if you have any thoughts about it too, do you have any insight or previous research on the benefits of psychoeducation advantages or concerns, the HYDOP model?
For psychoeducation, I don't think we have any hard data. There is a paper that's online, will be coming out in American Psychologist, where it's basically it has in the title translating promise into progress, 10 questions for research on HYDOP effectively. So 10 questions paper covers 10 topics on where that's Chris Conway led this effort with Avshalom Caspi, Bob Kruger, and myself. And one of the topics, so check out the whole paper, it's online, but one of the topics is about education of trainees. That's a bit different, of course, from psychoeducation. And we've put some hypotheses forward that we think it will work, but we don't better, that is, than DSM diagnosis, but we don't have the data yet. So I will save this question for Brady.
And the next question, a lot of individuals who are not covered in the clinical diagnosis at present will be able to get a diagnosis under any HYDOP dimensions, but then do we have treatment interventions for individuals or a group of problems referring to a subspectra?
Yes, so the question, I think, is that if you have a patient client presenting is a need for treatment, or at least seeking services, and HYDOP profile is above, let's say, T-score of 65, that is 1.5 standard deviations out, yet the person is not meeting criteria for diagnosis. Please correct me if I got this wrong. So this scenario, I think, fundamentally is no different than before we have a HYDOP profile for the person. So there is a person needing treatment, and DSM can't capture them, calls them subthreshold, or perhaps has relationship problems, what used to be VCODs as opposed to full diagnosis. So I don't think the kind of administrative issues here really change, unfortunately. Fortunately, we may have more of a clue based on the profile and what's elevated as to what issues are. And so, yes, a person may not, let's say, meet the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, just to pick an example, but is relatively elevated on trait anxiousness. So again, 1.5 standard deviations, almost there vis-a-vis GAD, doesn't quite have all the symptoms needed, or something like that. That we can make an assumption, test that assumption, basically make a hypothesis that effective treatments that we know to be efficacious for GAD would translate here. And it is early state of the science that we don't have randomized clinical trials specifically for high-top constructs. That I'm sure will come through in this entire workshop. That what we know is sort of taking from diagnostic categories and working it back to more dimensional constructs. But as we continue this research, and those of you who are in academia, I strongly encourage to consider such studies. And there are some already, such as a unified protocol that where the targets are dimensional, and but in any case, as a clinician on the front line, you're not going to do a study. You need guidance, and so the best guidance we have is sort of crosswalks between dimensions and the extremes and the diagnostic categories, which allows us to project that the treatments that are efficacious for these extremes may be efficacious for somewhat moderate manifestations of psychopathology.
There are two related questions. How come there is only a detachment subfactor rather than a detachment attachment subfactor? What about psychiatric conditions where patients suffer from problems associated with being overly attached? For example, codependency, which is an official diagnosis, but certainly is observed clinical phenomena, dependent PD, separation anxiety. And then the related question is, can psychopathology emerge on both ends of each dimension? To be extremely high or extremely low on any spectrum could be non-adaptive.
Well, all questions have been really interesting, but this one I'm most excited about because there is a lot to think about here. So to begin is detachment is not really interpretable in terms of attachment theory. Just to be clear, this is very descriptive. It is about needs for affiliation, expressivity, very behavioral. Then for attachment as independency, we do have dependency in the model, and it is sort of an internalizing domain, but further research may establish it as a separate spectrum. But at this point, it has not emerged as such. So it's on a lower level of internalizing. So it is covered, it is important, and overall, and it is not opposite of detachment, right? A person, the opposite of detachment is a person who is very gregarious, very proactive. They have no trouble with sort of setting up plans and vigorously pursuing them. They always have rewards, especially social rewards, that are driving them. It's theoretically could get into something like mania, but we really don't see that connection for detachment. There are other traits where we can see both ends to be maladaptive. And it's been measurement challenge to really construct such measures where so let's say sleep, for instance. Insomnia and hypersomnia are two ends of one construct, and in principle, both are a problem, both reflect dysregulation of psychological function, but they are not perfectly opposite. Like if you ask people, do you sleep too much? You don't ask them number of hours, but you ask them, for you, do you sleep too much? And then in the separate scale, you ask them, do you sleep too little? These scales you would think would be correlating -1. In fact, they're basically uncorrelated because some people endorse only one or the other, but some people endorse both. And what perhaps they're thinking is, some days I'm sleeping too much, other days I'm sleeping too little, or I'm sleeping too little, I'm sleeping too much, but I still not rested. Hence, I'm also going to endorse sleeping too little. The point is that this dysfunction aspect, of at least perceived by the person, their subjective assessment of dysfunction, overlaid on actual construct, makes that like basically once you get to pathology, forces the two ends of the construct to no longer be opposites. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. It's a sort of a measurement challenge that has been a real thorn, but others, like Tom Vidiger, are more optimistic that we will be able to measure overly adaptive end of dimensions, but so far has been a really tricky challenge.
Okay, and we're running low on time. Wanted to note that there were several questions related to diversity in the high top model. And with only 4 minutes left for Q&A, I don't think we have time to get into a lot of detail about that very important topic, but I do want to note that we have a full session dedicated to that tomorrow. And I think that might also be a good, if you have more questions about asexuality, Dr. Rodriguez-Sayas could probably address that as well in the presentation tomorrow. So I don't mean to put that off, just that it's such an important topic. I don't think we should try to address it in just a couple minutes.
I do want to mention that there is science on this within a HiTOP perspective, and I assume Craig will cover this as this is, but I can also refer folks to our new paper just this summer in psychological medicine, which covers a variety of topics vis-a-vis HiTOP, and one of them, so hence very abbreviated treatment, is differences and applications of the model in different sociodemographic groups. And so far, it looks like at least the structure of the model is consistent. Now, that's just step one, to ask, like, is the model valid for various subgroups? And we need more data there. There are a very limited number of studies, but studies that we do have say, yeah, model seems to work. The question is, how do you administer treatment and just conceptualize cases given the model and the really different context of different sociodemographic groups? And there we need a whole hour for sure.
So we have 2 more minutes just to pick out a couple ones. There was a question about whether we are interested in having other researchers with specialty, in this case specifically in translation, interested in participating in the HiTOP consortium.
Well, the clinical translation is a work group that David and Camilo co-chair, who is effectively sponsoring this workshop, made it happen. So those who are interested in participating can participate in 2 ways. David, please expand on this if I don't elaborate enough. One way is as members of clinical network, and that one of the ways to participate is to use something like HighTop.dat. We certainly have a lot of infrastructure for HighTop.dat, but that doesn't have to be to help us collect data, or either quantitatively or qualitatively, about how this is working, this dimensional diagnosis, or how it's helpful for treatment, where it faces challenges, and not only treatment, prognostication as well, communication with patients, with other providers, etc., etc. So that's one way to participate. Another one is to actually, if you're a member of the consortium, to join the work group and write papers, etc. So I will encourage everyone with such interest to contact David. He as our host.
Yeah, and to reiterate that, so if you have expertise in an area that you think HighTop could use you, we are definitely interested in collaborating. And just to go back to the diversity question too, I think that's a particular area where, well, we would definitely welcome more participants and more ideas into the consortium. So if you want to join the consortium or want to participate in any of these projects, contact me or contact Roman or Camilo or any of the other presenters, and would be thrilled to work with you. Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions on the chat. I think a lot of them are going to come up in the next presentation and the rest of the presentations today and tomorrow. So hopefully you'll have a chance to ask those questions of the speakers as we kind of go through the workshop. So with that, let's take a 10-minute break, and then at 9 o'clock we will hear from Dr. Sims and Dr. Jonas. And thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. So unfortunately, Len and Catherine both were unable to join us live today, so they recorded their presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and play that now. And just like last time, if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Sorry about this.
Hi, my name's Len Sims. I'm happy to chat with you guys today about clinical application of the CAT-PD and IDAS-2 measures as representatives of HITOP compliant measures. This is half of the presentation for this slot in the workshop. After this presentation, I know that Catherine Jonas will be talking to you as well about some of the more pragmatic issues in terms of how to implement these measures in clinical practice. My job today is to talk more about interpretation of these measures and some of their basic structure. The IDAS-2 and CAT-PD measures come from the dimensional psychopathology tradition, which is a response to the problems associated with traditional DSM-based psychiatric classification that you all are likely quite aware of if you're interested in the HITOP system more generally. Both of these measures preceded HITOP, but were part of the literature base that ended up resulting in the HITOP model. The IDAS-2 captures symptom dimensions relevant to the mood and anxiety disorders. CAT-PD includes trait dimensions relevant to personality pathology. However, as you all might know, these are not wholly independent domains of psychiatric functioning. For example, the CAT-PD has scales for things like depressiveness and things related to anxiety. In addition to the IDAS, it just gets at it more from a trait perspective rather than the IDAS, which gets at it more from a symptom over the last 2 weeks sort of perspective. Dimensional models and measures more cleanly reflect psychiatric phenotypes than do psychiatric syndromes. You know, things like symptom heterogeneity and comorbidity among diagnoses are things that we've long known tend to plague traditional psychiatric syndromes as defined in things like the DSM, and dimensional models and measures provide the promise of improving upon those limitations. HITOP is building a bunch of measures to assess and refine the model specifically, and I'm involved in that process. And frankly, that measure should be available for at least research use soon. But the IDAS-2 and CAT-PD are useful at this stage of the game since they're HITOP consistent, include scales relevant to all of the HITOP spectra. The HITOP measure that we're building will be even more suited to the specifics of the HITOP model, and it'll be more broad and all-encompassing. But for the time being, these two measures can get you a lot of bang for your assessment buck, so to speak. These measures both were developed in the construct validation tradition, which involves building measures from a theory basis to both measure constructs and to refine those constructs. You can kind of think of this as circular. The building of the measures actually helps you understand the constructs themselves. These methods, which are rooted in factor analysis and related structural techniques, tend to favor the development of homogeneous scales with strong discriminant validity, features that offer meaningful improvements over DSM and ICD-based measures, which tend to lack both of those things, as we discussed on the previous slide. So we'll start with the inventory. My plan today, let me back up, is to talk a little bit about each of the measures, and then get into a couple case examples that we'll talk about briefly. The original, this is the inventory of depression and anxiety symptoms, or the IDAS. We're on the second version of that now. It's published by David Watson and colleagues. The original IDAS contains 11 non-overlapping scales assessing specific depression and anxiety symptoms. And I'll give you a sense for those in a moment. The IDAS-2 is really an expanded version of the IDAS, and the goal of which was to create new scales assessing other important aspects of anxiety disorders, as well as key symptoms of bipolar disorder, which was not measured or was not really included in the original IDAS. Factor analyses of the expanded item pool led to creation of 7 new scales: traumatic avoidance, checking, ordering, cleaning, claustrophobia, mania, and euphoria, plus an expanded social anxiety scale. These scales are internally consistent. They show convergent discriminant validity in relation to other self-report interview-based measures of related constructs. They also demonstrate substantial criterion and incremental validity in relation to interview-based measures of DSM-based symptoms and disorders. I could do a whole talk just on all the validity evidence, but the whole point of this workshop presentation is to help you with interpretation. So I want to move on. I'm just going to quickly run through the different scales that the IDAS-2 includes, and I'll make these slides available for anyone who wants them from the perspective of reference materials. The IDAS-2 includes a general depression scale, which reflects a broad, relatively heterogeneous set of items relevant to the diagnosis of depression. These reflect the more traditional diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. This is kind of like using like a Beck depression inventory. It kind of taps different aspects of depression in a single scale, even though those items don't hang together as tightly as more narrow band dimensions, which is what most of the IDAS is comprised of. There's a dysphoria scale, which assesses individual differences in feeling sad, blue, down, unhappy, miserable, and discouraged. There's a lassitude scale, which measures this idea of feeling sleepy, tired, sluggish, drowsy, and exhausted, fatigue, lacking energy, that sort of thing. Insomnia is what it sounds like. It involves various sleep-related problems that result in reduced sleep quality and or quantity, problems falling asleep, problems staying asleep, problems waking up early in the morning, that sort of thing. Suicidality is quite straightforward as well. General thoughts about death, as well as more specific thoughts about killing oneself. Appetite loss, the behavioral dimension focused on reduction or loss of appetite, reduced interest in food, skipping meals, and so forth. And similarly, there's an appetite gain scale. Well-being goes in the other direction. This directly targets positive emotional experiences, such as feeling happy, cheerful, excited, and enthusiastic. And with respect to depression, we find that people with depression tend to score lower on a scale like well-being, which really reflects a positive affect or positive emotionality scale. Ill temper gets at anger problems, and hostility, irritability. Then we have a mania scale on the new IDAS, or on the IDAS-2. This reflects symptoms such as flight of ideas, pressure of speech, distractibility. Euphoria is similar in that it gets at elevated mood states that would traditionally be associated with bipolar. Elevated mood states in which the individual feels extremely up, elated, euphoric, and on top of the world. Getting into some anxiety content. Panic involves prominent symptoms of somatic anxiety, anxious arousal that are common in panic attacks. Social anxiety assesses fear and avoidance related to social interactions and performing in front of others. Claustrophobia centers on anxiety and avoidance of small places, getting trapped in public places. And then there are several trauma scales. There's a traumatic intrusion scale, which gets at the events and experiences in which one relives certain aspects of a trauma, including flashbacks, disturbing thoughts or memories, or triggers or dreams that remind someone of the trauma. There's traumatic avoidance, where there are questions or items reflecting people actively avoiding such triggers or such thoughts or feelings. There's a checking scale. Again, this is a newer scale on the IDAS-2. This construct includes symptoms such as checking certain things over and over again, checking repeatedly to see if things were done correctly, worrying about whether an intended activity was actually done, nagging doubts, that sort of thing. Similarly, there's an ordering scale. Reflects symptoms such as having the need to perform certain activities in a fixed, precisely defined order, needing to do activities a certain number of times, following rituals, and then a cleaning scale, which is relatively straightforward. I mentioned earlier that the IDAS-2 shows strong reliability. Here's a sampling of reliability coefficients, internal consistency reliability coefficients in patients, adults, and students. And you can see that with a rare exception, these are all in the strong range. Similarly, there are descriptive statistics here to provide good basic norms for the IDAS. And again, I'll provide these slides so that those of you who are interested can study it more carefully. Let me switch gears to the CAT-PD. The CAT-PD started as a computerized adaptive test. That's where the phrase CAT comes from. But most folks use the CAT-PD items and scales in a static form these days. We call it the CAT-PD SF or static form. So we've kind of branded, if you will, the CAT-PD to represent comprehensive assessment of traits relevant to personality disorders, or CAT-PD. It's a broad self-report measure of personality traits and functioning. It covers 5 of the 6 high-top spectra. Only somatoform is excluded. And 33 traits can be nested within those spectra. There's a high consistency between the CAT-PD measure and model and other personality-based measures such as the PID-5 and the Neo-Personality Inventory. And we have a paper in 2014 that actually shows how they jointly reflect a common 5-factor structure. The normative reference sample for the CAT-PD scales comes from a range of community-based sample collected in a medium-sized metropolitan area, Buffalo. And I have some details there about the nature of that normative sample. Similar to the IDAS-2, the CAT-PD scales, based on the way they were constructed, are internally consistent, and they show strong convergent discriminant validity in relation to other measures of personality pathology. Let me show you the scales are at least conceptually nested within 5 broad domains of something called the Psi-5 model. There are these scales that, at least at face value, are relevant to negative emotionality. I'll be going through these in greater detail in a moment. There's some scales related to positive emotionality, or the opposite end of that spectrum. Antagonism, disconstraint or constraint, and psychoticism. And again, I'll run through each of these in turn. I'll try to go relatively quickly so that I have time for the case presentation. So negative affectivity scales, there's an affective lability scale, which measures the tendency to experience strong, rapid, and unpredictable shifts in emotion and mood and related features. Anger is self-explanatory, gets at the tendency to experience and express emotions ranging from frustration and irritability to explosive temper and rage. There's an anxiousness scale, which gets at just general worry and the tendency to feel anxious. Depressiveness kind of gets at this general tendency to feel feelings such as sadness, melancholia, hopelessness, inferiority, that sort of thing. There's a health anxiety scale, which estimates the tendency to be worried about and preoccupied with one's own health and possible health problems. Then it gets into mistrust. It's an interpersonal mistrust more than anything. The scale appraises the tendency to question the honesty, motives, fidelity, loyalty, and believability of others, as well as the general attitude of jaded negativity, especially a disbelief in the integrity or professed motives of others. So it's an interpersonal mistrust. Similarly, there's a relationship insecurity, which gets at an interpersonal style characterized by interpersonal insecurity, fear of abandonment by others, jealousy, and the tendency to anxiously expect, perceive, or overreact to social rejection. Self-harm really gets at a range of self-injurious thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to both non-lethal forms and lethal forms. So it bridges both NSSI and outright suicidality. And then there's a submissiveness scale, which is placed here, but often attempts to cross-load on other factors at the same time, but it's here conceptually. But evaluates the yielding of power to others, over-accommodation of others' needs, exploitation by others, lack of confidence in one's own decision-making, that sort of thing. And finally, there's a cognitive problems scale, which assesses a range of mental deficits, including memory problems, confusion, disorientation, illogical, disorganized thoughts. There's lots of reasons why you could score high on this, but it just reflects self-reports of the sense that somehow my mind, my thoughts aren't operating as efficiently as we might like them to. There are scales related to antagonism, as I mentioned, so let's go through those. Callousness is really the opposite of empathy. It reflects cold-heartedness, disregard for the rights, feelings, and welfare of others, lack of sympathy and empathy. Domineering, the scale reflects the general need for power and the tendency to be controlling, dominant, and forceful in your relationships. Grandiosity measures a mixture of arrogance and entitlement. High scorers believe they're important and superior, and they act in condescending ways. They feel like they deserve special privileges, treatment. Hostile aggression is the other end of anger in a sense. And when it becomes aggression, it becomes an antagonism scale. This is a bit of a nasty aggression scale. It's hostile. The scale reflects a pattern of hostile and violent behavior that's either instrumental or reactive. In addition, the scale measures a tendency to be resentful, mean-spirited, vindictive, and even sadistic in some items. Manipulativeness, the behavioral pattern of taking advantage of and exploiting others to achieve self-serving goals. And there's also a deceitfulness component to this scale. Norm violation is really a behavioral measure, reflects a general disregard and active rejection of social rules and convention. It reflects a history of engaging in illegal antisocial acts, a pattern of disobedient behavior, that sort of thing. Rudeness is more subtle, but this measures a tendency to be blunt, overly frank, interpersonally insensitive, and tactless in interpersonal communication. Then we have a range of scales that get at the continuum between disconstraint and constraint. Sometimes it's called disinhibition. Some of the scales reflect the UPS model of impulsivity, if you're familiar with that model. I won't perseverate on that now, but speaking of perseveration, this is the non-perseverance scale. This scale is sensitive to difficulties in remaining focused and engaged on tasks that may be perceived as boring, challenging, frustrating, or not that enjoyable. Similarly, there's a non-planfulness scale, which measures the tendency to act on whims or on the spur of the moment without planning or concern for the consequences. Interestingly, those two scales could both be labeled impulsivity in previous literatures, and the UPS model, and we're trying to do that here as well, is to try to be more precise about the word impulsivity. So the word impulsivity doesn't really appear as a scale name on the CAT-PD, but rather there are multiple ways that one could appear quote unquote impulsive, and non-perseverance and non-planfulness are two of those ways. Risk-taking is a third way. Some people say, oh, this person's so impulsive, when they're really saying that the person's risk-taking. The measures the tendency to pursue and enjoy activities that are stimulating, thrilling, exhilarating, and potentially dangerous. Disconstraint concludes, can't talk, includes irresponsibility, measures the extent to which an individual fails to fulfill responsibilities, requirements, promises, and obligations in their relationships or other important life goals. Getting at the constraint side of things, we have several scales reflecting that on the CAT-PD. Perfectionism appraises the belief that any behavioral work that's not anything less than flawless is unacceptable. Rigidity gets at a different flavor of constraint. It gets at an inflexible adherence to one's personal views, values, morals, and an unwillingness to consider the validity of alternative viewpoints or to change one's mind. And finally, there's a workaholism scale that gets at a general preference and orientation toward work relative to relationships, relaxation, or other important aspects of life. Essentially, an excessive focus on achievement, status, and success in life. We have skills related to detachment. Social withdrawal looks at interpersonal interactions, preference for being alone. There's an emotional detachment, which gets at the tendency to be emotionally distant and reserved, difficulties experiencing, describing, and expressing one's emotions. Romantic disinterest reflects a general lack of interest in, desire for, and enjoyment of sex, eroticism, and interpersonal intimacy. Anhedonia, also related to depression, but this gets at general deficits in positive emotions and energy levels. High scores report difficulties in experiencing joy and excitement, show little interest in things, and exhibit lethargy, lassitude, and psychomotor slowness. Exhibitionism, it could also be considered an antagonism scale, depending on how it manifests. It's organized conceptually here, but it often loads on antagonism. This scale assesses the tendency to engage in and derive pleasure from a range of overt attention-seeking behaviors, behave in an overly flamboyant or theatrical manner, and act and dress in sexually provocative ways. And then finally, psychoticism scales. Unusual beliefs gets at the tendency to hold unfounded and irrational thoughts, beliefs, and ideas about the world, including beliefs about the powers of oneself, others, and objects to control and influence others and the physical world. Similarly, there's unusual experiences, which gets at more unusual perceptions, including perceptual distortions that do not correspond to reality, and also dissociation or detachment from reality, one's surroundings, or oneself. Fantasy proneness praises the tendency to fantasize, daydream, become fully engrossed in one's thoughts and experiences, sometimes to the extent of being distracted or losing sight of reality. And then finally, there's a self-reported peculiarity scale, which estimates the extent to which one's behavior, speech, appearance, and mannerisms are perceived as odd, unusual, or eccentric by others. Let's talk about some general interpretive considerations with the CAT-PD and the IDAS-2. This is general, and this is frankly not just for these measures, but I would argue for almost any self-report measure of personality or psychopathology. First, consider all descriptive or interpretive statements that you might glean from these measures to be hypotheses about the patient that need to be checked against extra test data like history, interview, reason for referral, collateral reports. I'm fond of saying to students that there's no truth in these tests. There's no objective truth. This is just these measures are an index of what someone's willing to tell you about themselves. And so for that reason, they may be telling you 100% exactly how they are, or there might be other reasons why they're saying the things that they're saying. At the end of the day, the things you learn from these tests are hypotheses. You can't assume they're truth just because they're on the piece of paper in front of you. You can assess then the validity of the profile. Some measures include validity scales. If there's any reason to question the validity of any of these measures, you have to say so and describe how that's going to limit the interpretive statements you can make. The CAT-PD, for example, has validity scales to measure inconsistency, positive impression management, and there's a frequency scale that gets at one hypothesis might be malingering or trying to fake bad. As you go through the IDAS and the CAT-PD or any other measures you're including, frankly, on a sheet of paper, list all the characteristics, both descriptive and interpretive, that you might have culled from those measures and from the outputs. Underline the robust descriptors that emerge from the different parts of the patient's responses, and then organize those descriptors into topical sections, like the ones I have listed there. Then you can develop an overall description of the individual based on those characteristics that might be emerging. Again, there's no truth in the test, and so you're also going to have to check those against other sorts of data to have more confidence in your conceptualization. For therapy cases, you might integrate your descriptive and interpretive characteristics with a model that you might be inclined to use for that client, like CBT, DBT, ACT, ACT, whatever you might want to use, that will serve as a basis for your case conceptualization, and then bridge your conceptualization to treatment recommendations. Then you have to write your report. I know we're not going to talk a lot about report writing here, but this is something I tell my own students. And that when you're writing up test results or your case conceptualization more generally, you need to make sure that you've been all these things, A through H, when you're all done with it. You can ask yourself, have I addressed the referral questions? If not, you got to rewrite the thing. Ask yourself, does the report make sense? If not, you got to rewrite the thing. Avoid jargon. There's lots of jargon in these tests. Can you describe these measures and the results of the test in a way that someone's grandmother might be able to understand or your client could understand? Does the report describe a recognizable human being? Sometimes I've read reports that they're a bunch of descriptions, but I can't imagine the human that this report means to describe. Does the report describe this particular person? If you're reading the report and it doesn't sound like the person you've been assessing, then you've obviously done something wrong. Attend to organization and flow. Don't just list a bunch of characteristics. We want this thing to tell a story about an individual. This could be tricky too. You want to be civil and decent in your language. Try to avoid pejorative jargon. And could you defend what you're saying in court? Do you understand why you said everything you said about this individual based on the test results and the data behind the test? So now I want to talk about I have two case examples, and maybe I'm going fast. If I were doing this in person, we'd have a lot of more opportunity for back and forth and question and answer, but I'm just kind of running through this. So here we go. So I'm going to talk about two case presentations very quickly and show their results on the IDAS and CAT-PD. The first of which is Caleb. That's not this person's real name, but this is a real patient that I saw. At the time of assessment, Caleb was a 28-year-old male, single Caucasian, was self-referred to therapy related to ongoing depression and loneliness. He reported that he has failed several previous stints in therapy because he doesn't see any improvement, yet he continues to feel depressed and lonely. He recently moved back to the area after taking a long trip to find himself. He reported having few friends and relatively little experience in romantic relationships, something he said he wanted to change. And he works several part-time jobs, lacks a sense of who he is and what he wants to do with his life. So let's show the results of the IDAS. So the IDAS-2, it should say here, you can see, and I'm going to run through my case conceptualization in a couple slides, but you can see this is color coded, and the way I've done it here so that deeper colors reflect higher elevations. These are scored using T-scores that are normed such that the mean score in the population will be 50 with a standard deviation of 10. And so things that are 60 to 70 are coded in yellow here, or anything between 1 and 2 standard deviations above or below the mean is in yellow. Anything 2 standard deviations to 3 standard deviations, 70 to 80, is coded in orange, and anything above 3 standard deviations above the mean or below the mean is coded in red here. And so you can see that suicidality is something that is striking from this listing of scores, but also things related to depression and anhedonia and well-being. Social anxiety is elevated, and there's some sense of trauma that needs to be followed up on with the client, and I'll say more about that on my conceptualization side. On this slide, we see the results from the CAT-PD. And again, because there's some overlapping content, you see similar patterns. Things like depressiveness and anhedonia are elevated, as is social withdrawal. Those are all consistent with what we see on the IDAS-2. But you start to get a flavor of some additional personality items going on here. You see anger's elevated, callousness is elevated, emotional detachment's elevated. You have a bunch of things. The sense of peculiarity, manipulativeness is modestly elevated, relationship insecurity, risk taking, rudeness. You can start to get a sense for some personality dimensions that might be driving this as well. And I'll say more about that now. So my conceptualization for Caleb is as follows, and I hope that you see the way I brought in some of the features of the testing as we go here. So Caleb was moderately to severely depressed when I first saw him, and he actually remained that way throughout treatment for the most part. I have to say that my treatment with him was not particularly effective. Hopefully, not my fault. I'll say more about that at the bottom here. It was manifested by multiple scales tapping distress, traditional depression symptoms, and anhedonia. He was also reporting a lot of suicidal ideation, which actually came and went various times throughout therapy. Although he never made an attempt, he almost always had some ideation regarding suicide. Caleb was was an angry young man and resentful of the way that his parents treated him relative to his disabled brother when he was growing up. He views his upbringing as traumatizing, so that if you recall, he had a traumatic intrusions elevation. He hasn't had a typical criterion A trauma, but he views the differential treatment that he and his disabled brother received as traumatizing to him, and that's an important part of his narrative. As a young adult, Caleb has developed a style of emotional and social detachment, yet he states that he wants and needs friends and romantic partners. He shows a high degree of relationship insecurity, which is easily triggered by any sign of rejection, which causes a feedback loop with his tendency toward depression, detachment, and withdrawal. So it kind of creates this situation where he's easily triggered to feel rejected. He avoids those situations, and then it makes it harder and harder to have those connections. He's also underperforming in his career and reports lower levels of conscientiousness. Via interview, it's clear that he has identity concerns and would prefer not to have to work and yet still have the resources to do what he wants in life. So it's a bit of an immature sort of style of operating where he wants what he wants but doesn't want to have to work particularly hard for it. In treatment, we focused on trying to improve his social engagement, clarifying his personal and career identity, providing skills to deal with distress and suicidality. Through treatment, a clear pattern of vulnerable narcissism also emerged, which was not seen in the IDAS or CAT-PD, which is a good lesson here that these measures don't measure everything that you might want to know about an individual. And there's some characteristics that you're only going to learn from talking to somebody over a certain amount of time. And this vulnerable narcissism really seemed to be an impediment to treatment progress. And he always felt that he knew best, even though his life wasn't going the way he would like it to go. Any advice that I would ever offer, that other previous therapists had offered to him, he tended to dismiss fairly easily. That won't work for me. Nothing will work for me. This is just the way it's going to be. I know what's best for me. That sort of thing. Now, this is the time where I would ask if there were any questions or comments, but because I don't have you in person, I will just move on to the next one. So we have a second case presentation. This person is called Samantha in this presentation. 29-year-old female, single, Caucasian, self-referred for therapy related to ongoing depression, self-harm, loneliness, and difficulties coping with her recent move to Buffalo for a professor position. She reported that she has a history of romantic relationships with men who are significantly older than her and have tended to be abusive, mostly emotionally, to her. One such relationship occurred when she was 14 years old, when a teacher began showing sexual interest in her. She reports consenting to the relationship at the time, but now believes it was coercive and speculates on the effect it had on her. She now is in a creative field and is having difficulty managing the many gigs that she has been offered in addition to her teaching position at the university. Moreover, she has difficulty navigating relationships and currently maintains contact with several previous partners in long-distance relationships that are not particularly fulfilling to her. At the time of intake, she was severely depressed and suicidal, and she engaged in regular self-harming behavior such as cutting. So there's some similarities to Caleb, some differences, and so we'll see how these profiles differ and are similar to one another. So you can see more red on this IDAS relative to Caleb. The suicidality scale is over 6 standard deviations above the mean. She really topped out on suicidality. I'll say more about that in a moment. But other things related to depression more generally, she really across the board was talking about symptoms related to depression, suicidality, and a relatively severe level. She also scored, if you can see, there's an elevation on mania, 85.3. And so I had to assess whether that reflects true mania or whether that's there's some other reason for that scale to be elevated. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And also a quite significant elevation on panic, not other anxiety scales so much, but definitely panic. And also she endorsed a moderate elevation on traumatic intrusions, which makes sense given some of her history. On the CAT-PD, similarly, there's some overlap with the IDAS. Depressiveness and self-harm are elevated, which you would expect given the IDAS profile. More generally, another one of the red elevations was affective lability. So not in addition to feeling depressed and anxious and having these self-harming ideas, there's a lability to Samantha's profile that we didn't really see with Caleb. But there's a whole range of other things that are elevated here as well. You know, we have anger and anhedonia, anxiousness more generally. We'll touch on interpersonal mistrust was a big piece for her. Perfectionism, relationship insecurity. I'm just hitting some of the high points, and then submissiveness. These are the things that are going to show up largely in the conceptualization I'll show you next. I guess the point is that between the IDAS and the CAT-PD, we get a sense not only for how she operates from a more traditional symptom basis, but what are some of the personality characteristics that might be giving some additional flavor to the way these manifest. So here's the conceptualization summary that I'll present for Samantha. Samantha is severely depressed, is manifested by multiple scales tapping distress, traditional depression symptoms, and anhedonia. She also reported high levels of suicidality and NSSI, and indeed had recently been hospitalized for such. I hadn't said that before, but she'd been, right before she came to see me, she'd been hospitalized, and in fact, she's been hospitalized at least once during my treatment with her. She reports significant affective lability and impulsive behavior associated with such. She also reported significant panic and anxiety related to keeping up with her large workload and also meeting others' expectations for her. She also reported mania, I put it in quotes there, which upon discussion with her, I really interpreted as reflecting her tendency to work long hours for work rather than true mania per se. I mean, she could stay up for 24 hours working if she had a deadline, but it didn't have the same flavor as a proper manic episode. It just seemed like an accommodation she's making given how much work she tended to put on her plate. At the time I saw her, she really had 2 full-time jobs, one as a professor and one as something doing other things. She reported moderate traumatic intrusions related to that sexually exploitative relationship between herself and the teacher. This relationship resulted in maladaptive patterns that have repeated themselves in subsequent adult relationships, including high degrees of interpersonal mistrust and relationship insecurity. Further, despite a high intellect and career success, she adopts a submissive interpersonal style that tends to meet others' needs, but results in resentment and her not getting her own needs met. She was conceptualized as manifesting many traditional borderline personality disorder symptoms and was treated with a DBT-inspired skills-based treatment. But we didn't stick rigidly to DBT. We coupled it with more deeper discussions, dynamic, if you will, of her previous trauma and the impact it might have had, might be having on her past and current relationships and emotional life. So, as I hope you can see, the IDAS and the CAT-PD by themselves don't give you everything you need to know about a client, but they provide interesting data points that need to be integrated if you're fully going to understand what's going on for an individual. And I think in both the case of Caleb and Samantha, I hope I was able to demonstrate that I was able to pull together some of the features of the test with other things I knew about these clients to help generate and describe a conceptualization that goes beyond kind of a static, flat test assessment. Okay. Normally, I would ask here if there are questions or discussion, but since I don't have you, I can't do that. But I do have my email address here. So if anybody has questions on either of these two measures or about the case presentations that I made, feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to converse that way. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop. Bye.
Okay, so that's the presentation from Len Sims. The next presentation will be from Catherine Jonas, and unfortunately, she's also not with us live today, but was recorded a presentation. So I will go ahead and start.
Hi, everybody. This is Catherine Jonas. I'm an assistant professor at Stony Brook University, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the HiTOP Digital Assessment and Tracker, our sort of Qualtrics/REDCap based intake assessment with HiTOP friendly measures. And you just heard from Len about the CAT PD and the IDAS. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple more measures and how the DAT works in case you're interested. And if there's time, I'll do one quick case report. Right. Here we go. Right. So probably very well familiar with this. This is Mary's lovely figure depicting the HiTOP model. Let's blow it up a little bit bigger. And the aim of the HiTOP DAT is to have a comprehensive assessment of all of the spectra in this model. So somatoform, internalizing, thought disorder, detachment, disinhibited, and antagonistic externalizing. And so the HiTOP DAT was developed to meet this need. It's based all on publicly available free to use assessments that are HiTOP friendly that have been put into Qualtrics and REDCap, and we have an automated scoring and norming system so that this can be implemented in clinical practice. So I'm going to walk you through that system now. The DAT is useful for a number of reasons, relevant to HiTOP, but just also relevant to general practice. Empirically based intake assessments are really important to measurement-based care, quality of care, to standardize all intakes to reduce bias and prevent missing important elements of psychopathology. This information, the way we've set up the DAT, it's administered before the intake interview. So coming into the intake before meeting somebody, you already have some data which you can use to hone your intake interview, focus on the stuff that really matters, saves a lot of paperwork, and can also, if you implement the longitudinal follow-up assessments, can automate outcome monitoring and sort of the longitudinal elements of measurement-based care. That's something that you're interested in. We do have a manual for the DAT. This is just on Open Science web platform. So if you search for HiTOP DAT manual, you'll find it there. There's a lot more information in the manual. So if this is interesting to you, I highly suggest checking out the manual. So Len told you about the CAT PD and the IDAS. I'm going to tell you about the other measures listed here. Most of the ones I'll talk about today are focused on symptoms over the past 2 weeks or the past month. On average, folks who have completed the full battery take about 45 minutes to complete it. Depends if you add on more, like some clinics add on consent forms and other paperwork beforehand, but these measures themselves take about 45 minutes. So you may very well be familiar with the audit and the DUDIT. These are self-reported measures of alcohol and drug use, and they're quite short, and they're normed relative to samples recruited from primary healthcare for the audit and to a community sample for the DUDIT. For all of the scoring in the DAT, including the IDAS and CAT PD, we've looked for the best norms that we have available to approximate the kind of patient population or community kind of sample that would be coming into an outpatient clinic. They're not perfect by any means. Note that this is like a Swedish sample Many of these are not American, they're US based, although maybe you're not either. So just be careful about the norms and think about the individual you're seeing and whether the norms that are used in the DAT are appropriate for the person you're seeing. We also have the community assessment of psychotic experiences. There are 3 subscales in the CAPE. We're only using 1 because the other 2 are pretty well covered by the IDAS and the CAT-PD, and because they do tend to be pretty highly correlated. So we have only the subscale that assesses positive symptoms, and it's normed relative to an Australian community sample, around 300 people. PHQ-9 is an assessment of symptoms, physical symptoms that are most often observed in somatization disorders, and it's normed relative to a German community sample of around 9,000 people. Also note that in the standard version of the PHQ-15, there are questions that are, there's one item about severe menstrual symptoms. And this, is another area to consider the norms. There are different norms for men and women, but of course there are transgender individuals who may describe them, may have may menstruate, but be entered into the system as their gender as identity as male. So again, be careful with the scoring here and the norming. And lastly, the HUDAS, which is a measure of global disability calibrated by the World Health Organization. Again, publicly available, nice norms on this, 8,800 Australian adults. And it covers a number of different domains of disability listed here. So important to make sure that individuals who are sent the HiTOP DAT meet various inclusion criteria. You can complete it. We have the HiTOP DAT implemented in Qualtrics and in REDCap, but that means that the person needs to have access to a phone or or computer with internet access. They will also need an email address at which to receive the invitation to complete the DAT. The norms are all based on adults, so individuals should be 18 or older. The reading level is at about a 6th grade reading level, so we don't currently have other language versions of the DAT, so be aware of the patient's first language and language skills, as well as it's probably not appropriate for people with various cognitive disabilities that might preclude them from understanding some of the more complicated items. The way we do this at Stony Brook is that when people call to schedule an intake appointment at our clinics, they're informed that they're going to receive an email with a link, and they should complete the assessments in the link. As soon as the individual completes the DAT, the assessments are automatically scored and normed, and the provider is sent a report of the results. This is what it looks like for patients who are completing the DAT. This is like the desktop interface for the Qualtrics version, I believe. So pretty standard format. There's also both REDCap and Qualtrics have smartphone based interfaces, which are pretty good. These are pretty long assessments to do on a smartphone, but can be done. We also have an extra screening measure for suicide and self-harm skills. These are in the IDAS and the CAT-PD. So if a person is in the upper 16 percentile of reported suicidal thoughts or self-harm thoughts, an email is sent to them with some resources that they may want to take advantage of if it's the acute crisis situation. So suicide hotlines. Also, we include local resources, crisis hotlines, Stony Brook Emergency Room. That email sent to the patient can and should be adapted to your site. And an email is also sent to the provider, just letting them know that this individual is at somewhat increased risk. As you can see, this is a somewhat conservative threshold, and like we want to minimize false negatives. And so the threshold is somewhat low for triggering this alert so that providers know if there's sort of any risk as far as this assessment goes. So approximately 20% of people are getting a flag in our outpatient sample, but providers are sent a report that includes the individual's responses to the items that go into these scales so they can see exactly what symptoms the person is reporting. And the provider can then do a number of things. We have a sort of tiered system. If it seems like there's no immediate crisis, it may not be necessary to do anything, particularly if the person's intake appointment is approaching rapidly. At other times, if a person's intake, if there's a long wait list and the intake is a ways off, we sometimes move people up and try and get them in a little bit earlier. And in really serious situations, we reach out to the person, give them a call, make sure they receive the email with resources, or maybe just check on them to make sure that they're not in a crisis situation. And if they are, intervene. We've not had to do that, but it is an option. So think of maybe a tiered system of response to these flags. So yeah, as soon as the person completes the assessments, the scores are automatically calculated and normed relative to those reference populations I described earlier. And all the scores are converted to a T-scale metric. So if you remember your scale distribution, the T-score has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. And that means a score greater than 65 will be in the 84th percentile. Above 70 will be in the 98th percentile. 75 will be in the 99th percentile. So score over 65, we'll go through a table of results, but I often sort of scan the T-scores for anything above 65 and take particular note of anything above 75. But obviously this is high-top, this is dimensional. So the idea is that you have all the information available to decide what the treatment priorities should be, what seems to be the most important treatment target, what things are the most notable, which are maybe milder or more secondary symptoms. Right. So this is what the text-based report looks like. I believe this is the text-based report as implemented in REDCap. It's actually, this is a somewhat old figure, my apologies. It's been reorganized so that it's organized by high-top spectra, so internalizing, disinhibition, antagonism, thought disorder, etc. There's also a visual report if you're using either REDCap or Qualtrics and you or your institution has access to Tableau, you can build a link between those two softwares and you can pipe your data into Tableau, and we have some nice dashboards that you can use to visualize patients' results. All right, and we also have a longitudinal follow-up that can be automated if you like. It's right now, we don't want people to redo the entire 45-minute assessment at every follow-up. So what we do is we re-administer the HUDAS and the IDAS. It's almost everybody self-presenting, voluntarily presenting for treatment in an outpatient clinic. It's going to have some degree of distress, which the IDAS captures, impairment, which is captured by the HUDAS. And then for people who reported substance use problems at baseline, we'd re-administer the audit and do it. This is pretty quick to, and you'll see, actually you won't see here, but in the report I'm going to show you in a moment, you will be able to see how those longitudinal scores populate the report. So I will share that case report. All right. So this is the reorganized report, starting with psychosocial impairment up at the top. And you can see how we have 3 different columns here for individuals who repeat the assessment over time. So intake is always in the leftmost column and the most recent assessment is always in the right. So as people complete follow-ups, these scores move along. So you always have intake on the left, T-1, so the last assessment they completed in the middle column, and the most recent assessment in the right column. This person's only completed the intake, so leftmost and rightmost columns are the same. So I'm just going to go down the rightmost column here of their current scores. So this person has some psychosocial impairment, reporting insomnia, it's notably high. Ill temper is also high. Traumatic intrusion. Sometimes traumatic intrusions can, a high score on this scale can also just reflect intrusive thoughts, not necessarily traumatic thoughts or unwanted thoughts. So this person's having, intrusive, unpleasant thoughts, not sleeping, irritable, some claustrophobia and social anxiety, a little bit of an ordering session there. These scores are fairly low, so not a whole lot of, so mostly from the CAT-PD, so not a lot of like trait negative affect, even though right now at the moment they're completing it, they are reporting some distress. And not much on mania. Notably, I don't think this was covered in the last talk, but well-being is one of the few scales, I think maybe the only scale where you might interpret it if it's particularly low, like if it's below 35, 1.5 standard deviations below 50. That indicates, that's almost more of an indicator of depression than mania per se. So some drug use, nothing too immediately important, some degree of workaholism, given the insomnia and the other things that, you kind of wonder if this individual is like staying up late, obsessively, obsessing cognitively or behavioral over things. And then we have a very high CAPE score here, so psychotic symptoms. So even though this person doesn't have high scores on mania, they are currently reporting that they're not sleeping very well, they're irritable, that they're having some psychotic symptoms. You want to follow up on this, sure. So this to me actually indicates maybe somebody, if not in a manic episode or hypomanic episode, maybe in an agitated sort of subthreshold psychotic state. So those are the kind of symptoms that I would follow up with this individual with. This individual actually is somebody who presented to our outpatient clinic for a assessment of disability, and they have a history of bipolar disorder, a distant history of substance abuse. They were psychotic when they came to the clinic and were very irritable with front office staff, and unfortunately didn't come back and complete the assessment. So all we have is this intake, but matched pretty well their presentation when they did eventually come in. All right, so I'm just going to return last time with this here. So you have my contact information. If you're interested in the DAT, we've sent it to many clinics across the United States, many university clinics, and also some community clinics, which is wonderful. So if you're interested in implementing this, either in your own clinic or at your institution, please reach out to me and we'll get you a copy in the format that is best for you. And we can talk about tailoring it, making it work for you. We have setup instructions, we have the manual, there is support. So this is if this is something you're interested in doing, reach out to me, get you set up. All right, thanks very much for your attention, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I was able to monitor some of the questions in the chat. Just a couple of things that we can potentially address quickly. If you want to access the HiTop-DAT and Qualtrics, then contacting Catherine at the email address that she provided, and we can share that in the chat as well. That's the best way to do that. The HiTop-DAT takes about 40 to 45 minutes for the typical client to complete. And I'll look at the other questions and hopefully we'll be able to address them in a few minutes. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Leanna, who will give the next talk.
Thanks, David. Is it going to switch over to me? Do I have to start talking or something to?
It should be on you now. Can you share your screen?
Yeah, okay, I will do that. Let's see. Do you see my slides?
Yes. Looks good.
Excellent. Well, good morning. I only have a half hour with you, so I'm going to jump right in and get started. If this will work. It's not clicking ahead. Well, let me try this. There we go. First, a disclaimer, I'm the author and copyright owner of the SNAP, and there's no licensing fee for use of the SNAP family of measures for non-commercial and funded research. All other areas, commercial research, paid clinics, I negotiate an acceptable fee. And I mention this because I am going to talk about some SNAP results today. So the outline for the talk is I'm going to introduce you to our clinic, the Notre Dame Adult Assessment Clinic, who we are, what we assess, measures we use. And then my plan is to walk you through our standard assessment. Excuse me one second. David, is there a way to get rid of these pictures? They're blocking my, there we go, got it. Never mind. Walk you through our standard assessment process, which includes traditional diagnoses, and then to show how useful it is to put the results into a high-top framework when trying to understand the person's problems as a whole. So I'm going to start with the referral questions and then cover the other areas that you see on the slide. And next, I'm going to tell you about the results of the assessment organized by the major domains that we assess, which are shown here. And then summarize those results by assessment domain, and in some cases by measure. And then I'll take you through a step-by-step crosswalk of the results to the high-top framework and discuss how the high-top perspective facilitates understanding the overall case presentation. So who we are a practicum within our clinical program, and second and third year clinical psychological science PhD students do the assessment practicum in the first or second year of their practicum experience. We assess people from a community mental health center, from the Notre Dame community, mostly students, but some staff and faculty, and the broader Michigan, Indiana population. The measures we use, we start with a demographic questionnaire online, and then follow with a semi-structured clinical interview, which covers pretty standard history of various different domains, current symptoms, the context, the onset, the functional impact, and any treatment that they are currently in, if any. Many of our clients are not currently in treatment. For psychosocial functioning and disability, we use a battery of measures shown here, and I'll get into the details of those when I present the results. For cognitive assessment, we always give the WAIS and WIMS, and this is because we are not only a service clinic, but also a training clinic, and this is so the students can build up their experience for internship applications. For standard diagnostics, we start with the DSM-5 level 1 screen and follow with the mini international neuropsychiatric interview. I'll tell you more about the DSM later. The mini is a semi-structured interview that assesses 15 common mental disorders. We routinely give the MMPI-2-RF simply because it's still the most widely used measure of personality psychopathology per nationwide surveys of practicing clinicians, so we think our students should be familiar with it. We give other dimensional psychopathology measures as needed based on the clinical interview, such as the SNAP for personality pathology. We give a couple of measures, including the ASRS for the many requests we get for ADHD assessment, particularly from our college students referrals. They're having trouble in school, and so they think maybe they have ADHD. We find that they do have ADHD maybe 15% of the time. Usually it's anxiety, depression. And a couple of measures, including the one shown here, for an increasing number of requests for assessment of autism spectrum disorder. We also have measures of experiential avoidance, dissociation, and so on that we use on an as-needed basis. And in fact, we add measures to our battery just as needed when a client clearly warrants it, and we know of a good one, we add it, and then it's there for future use. So the particular case I'm going to present was referred from the Community Mental Health Center. The referral question was assessed for a specific learning disorder and wanted diagnostic clarification for a wide array of symptoms. Demographics, behavioral observations. The client was a 35-year-old white non-Hispanic woman with a 7th grade education. She was oriented, although her affect was somewhat blunted with minimal facial expression, gestures, vocal inflection. She had a family history of bipolar disorder by report, her mother and maternal grandmother. She also reported that her mother, when she was growing up, was verbally and emotionally abusive to her, belittling her, putting her down. And her father was largely absent. He worked 2 jobs and was extremely quiet and avoidant. She suspected that that's how he dealt with the mother's abusive behavior. She grew closer to her father after her mother died 3 years ago. Her current situation is she lives with her father, her 8-year-old son, and her brother. They're all supported by father's Social Security disability income. Education-wise, she said she was a slow learner, didn't really read well until about age 16, always struggled with math, and that she was ill-treated by teachers. They called her lazy, she said. There was no special education available in her school. Her mother tried to get her held back a year so she could build a better foundation, but the school said no, because the kids will make fun of her for being held back. But what happened was the kids made fun of her because she didn't do very well in school. She quit school in 8th grade due to increasing panic attacks and depression, and she had begun cutting herself for relief. Her social and occupational history: she had few to no friends in school. She occasionally would have a friend. Let me turn that off, sorry. They would make friends with her for a short period of time and then move on. She had few current friends. She basically had her family, some social media friends, and a few from her previous job. She had had a brief romantic relationship with another woman, but broke that off due to her partner's lying and cheating, and that was the only romantic relationship she'd ever had. She worked at Wendy's for 8 years and was fired for poor performance after she snapped at a manager when he criticized her. She was hired back for short periods of time, and when asked why she didn't try to get a different job, she said she preferred the familiarity, even if it was extremely stressful. And in both cases, she quit because she found the job overwhelming and extremely stressful, and so is currently unemployed. She's been on 5 different antidepressants since she was in 7th grade, currently an SSRI and an atypical antipsychotic, supposedly, according to her, for anxiety. And those are the drugs for those of you who are familiar with them. And she started psychotherapy for the first time last year and said she had never been assessed previously. Her current situation was that she was clearly severely depressed and anxious, and she had an extreme fear of criticism and negative evaluation. All of this ties in with her history traceable to the maternal abuse, teacher and peer mistreatment, lack of resources to help with any difficulty. She had to deal with things on her own. Her family was not particularly helpful. She was unable to go out alone. Her father would drive her to the clinic because she would get anxious, which would become a panic, and she essentially had developed agoraphobia. She said she preferred familiarity. Uncertainty and lack of control were her triggers for anxiety, and she used self-isolation to cope with this. This last bit was what first raised the possibility in our minds of ASD. And these revelations of her having a hard time making and keeping friends, she said she had difficulty reading other people's intentions and that they had trouble understanding her. She didn't express herself well, she felt, increased the likelihood that the autism spectrum was an element in her difficulties. Finally, she said she struggles with daily activities, paying bills, navigating bus routes, things like that. In terms of the psychosocial functioning and disability measures, she scored a 3.25 on the SFQ, which is a 8-item general functioning measure with 1 to 4. So the areas of greatest difficulty were finances and getting and keeping close relationships. She also had moderate to severe difficulty at work and at home, feeling lonely and isolated. She said she had difficulty enjoying any leisure time and getting along well with her family. On the HUDAS, these are Z-scores using community norms, mild to moderate impairment on activities of daily living, getting along, work, more moderate impairment in cognition, and severe impairment in social participation. On the satisfaction with life scale, which is a very brief 5-item scale, she scored 7s, highly dissatisfied on every question. And the Sheehan Disability Scale scored 0 to 10. Overall, she said her symptoms disrupt her life at an 8.3, a marked level, especially work, social life, with less impairment in family life. Here are cognitive test results. The key points to note here is that her overall cognitive ability is in the low average range, with average verbal comprehension, borderline impairment in perceptual reasoning. These results suggest that she should have been able to learn to read far earlier than she did. And had she been able to read with otherwise adequate schooling in a more supportive environment, she likely would have been able to get through high school, or at least to get a GED at some point. In terms of memory, the results are comparable but trending lower than her general cognitive ability, with particular difficulty in visual memory and immediate memory. And this slightly better delayed memory suggests that if she can get information into her brain, she has some ability to retain it. Comparing these two sets of scores indicates that her memory was generally lower than expected based on her general cognitive ability. So that would be something to look into further if she were in treatment with you. There's a lot to take in on the Wyatt. We did this because of her lack of schooling. We wanted to get a current assessment of her achievement abilities. So I've highlighted the significant findings. Again, the total achievement was low average, commensurate with her general cognitive ability, but with notable difficulty in spelling and mathematics. The supplemental scales add notable difficulty in decoding and pick up again on orthographic processing being very low overall, particularly spelling. But again, the thing to note is the average and low average scores here, they're not in the markedly impaired range across the board. There are quite a number of significant differences between her overall score and her subtest scores. But you'll note that only mathematics has a positive value, meaning it's the only one that's lower than her overall score. So in all other cases, she performs significantly better on the subtests compared to her overall score: reading, decoding, basic reading, phonological processing, etc. So again, we may surmise that under other circumstances, she likely could have had an overall positive school outcome rather than dropping out in 8th grade. We use the DSM-5 Level 1 screen to start the diagnostic testing. It's freely available on the DSM-5 website of the American Psychiatric Association, as are all of the follow-up measures should someone screen positive, meaning a 2 or higher. This slide lists the 14 areas that are assessed by this screening measure and the number of questions that each area includes. The different work groups put together these screening questions for their areas. So for example, the personality disorders work group put together the 2 personality disturbance items, which mostly are getting at criterion A rather than the traits, for those of you who are familiar with the alternate model of personality disorder. The follow-up measures are available for the areas highlighted here. Notably, they are all dimensional measures, and again, all freely available on the APA website. And here are the areas that the client screened positive. And as you can see, there are multiple mood and anxiety related disorders highlighted, somatic concerns, sleep, memory problems, obsessions and or compulsions, dissociation, personality disturbance. So really a lot going on. For cognitive testing, we did, whoops, I think I skipped one. Yeah, there we go. On the mini, the semi-structured interview, these are the diagnoses that she met criteria, more than half of the 15 diagnostic areas in the interview. And then per cognitive testing, we did diagnose her with a specific learning disorder with written impairment in written expression and mathematics. So I mentioned we give the MMPI-2 RF routinely. And by the way, if you use the MMPI, I strongly suggest switching to the MMPI-3 now that it's out. It moves the MMPI another step towards being fully oriented toward factor analytically derived major dimensions of psychopathology, away from its empirical keying origins that were pounded into my head when I was a graduate student at Minnesota many, many years ago. In this case, we also give the SNAP because of the indication in the DSM-5 level 1 screen and her reported problems with interpersonal relations, plus extremely low self-esteem in the clinical interview. We gave 2 ADHD screeners because the cognitive testing had indicated some low attention and concentration problems. And we gave her the 2 ASD screeners because of her reported preference for familiarity and sameness. She reported sensory sensitivity. For example, she always wore the same clothes because she said that they were the only ones she felt comfortable in. She had was sensitive to textures. Her social interpersonal difficulties, rigidity, aloofness. Here's her MMPI-2 validity scales. Technically, this represents an invalid profile with extreme elevations on infrequent and infrequent somatic responses, high elevations on infrequent psychopathology, symptom validity, response bias. All of this indicates over-reporting, especially cognitive and somatic symptoms. But it otherwise seemed consistent with her clinical picture, and her variable true responding were more or less normal, particularly the true response set. So we went ahead with reviewing the clinical scales profile, keeping in mind the over-reporting. It's consistent with the clinical picture, again, starting with demoralization. The highest T-scores are on somatic concerns, depression, dysfunctional negative emotions, and aberrant experiences. Plus cynicism is just above the cut point, and RC 4 and 6 just below. Again, nothing really new here, just corroboration of what we'd learned in the clinical interview. The SNAP has a more normal validity profile, just deviance and back deviance, which is deviance measured on the second half of the test, because it picks up fatigue, for example, were elevated. And the overall index of invalid responding was right at a T-score of 50, right at the norm. This is the negative emotionality set of scales. It was elevated negative temperament, particularly mistrust. Manipulative and aggression were right at normal range, very high self-harm, high on both of its subscales, which are suicide proneness and self-esteem, somewhat high on eccentric perceptions, and dependence was also quite high. That was a new bit of information that we really had not gotten from the clinical interview. In terms of positive emotionality, 3 of the positively keyed scores were low, so very low positive temperament, low exhibition. She's very much hates being in the limelight, attention being paid to her. And entitlement underscores the low self-esteem. She's very low in entitlement. I don't deserve anything kinds of items. And very high on detachment. And I might say this particular combination of dependency and detachment is very bad for interpersonal relationships because it's keeping people away, but depending on them nonetheless. And this third group of disconstraint is right in the normal range, so nothing going on there. In terms of her ADHD measures, both current and childhood scores were elevated, but hyperactivity was higher than inattention. And this could be consistent with ADHD, but it also could be picking up difficulty paying attention due to anxiety, depression, and the hyperactivity could be related to her bipolar disorder. So definitive diagnosis requires additional information of the report, specific tests of attention, and we only screen for ADHD, so we do refer clients elsewhere if they want a definitive diagnosis. Same with autism spectrum disorder, both measures scores were elevated, especially sensitivity, rigidity, aloofness, social anxiety. But again, these are screeners, so if they want a definitive diagnosis, requires additional treatment. So kind of a quick summary of the 4 areas that we assessed, sort of melding across the different psychosocial functioning areas. She had mild to moderate difficulty in basic self-care and household tasks, moderate difficulty in cognition and family life, and marked or severe difficulty in her social life and work with a high dissatisfaction across the board. Cognitive ability, as I said, general intellect and achievement were low average with particular weaknesses in perceptual reasoning, math, and spelling. Memory was lower than predicted by the general intellect and achievement with particular weaknesses in visual and immediate memory. The DSM-5 diagnoses, in addition to the specific learning disorder, she had several different depressive disorders, several different anxiety disorders, and binge eating disorder. Looking at the self-report measures for personality and psychopathology, the MMPI-2 was marked by over-reporting, especially cognitive and semantic. The affective symptom dimensions, a lot of negativity, low positive emotions, mistrustfulness came out with the cynicism, and then the somatic complaints and aberrant experiences. In the SNAP, a similar picture, some unusual experiences was the main kind of over-reporting. Affective symptoms, again, negative temperament, low positive temperament, low self-esteem, and a greater picture of the interpersonal difficulties in addition to the detachment and mistrust, which we saw elsewhere, also picked up dependency. In the ADHD and ASD screening, we saw the hyperactivity, but consistent with multiple diagnoses. ASD elevated on both measures, consistent with the reports in the clinical interview, and didn't seem to be other good explanations for this. So we suspect that somewhere on the autism spectrum disorder, but again, a definitive diagnosis requires follow-up testing. So putting the personality and psychopathology and DSM results together, affective dimensions from the MMPI, SNAP, and ASD suggests lots of difficulties in the negative temperament and positive temperament domains. And if you throw in the DSM, we've got multiple depressive and anxiety disorders plus binge eating disorder. Affective dimensions, high distress, low positivity, interpersonal relationships, difficulties here with aloof and detachment, mistrust, and social anxiety, cognitive sensory processing, the somatic sensitivity, unusual thought processes. And so boiling that all down, we've got the distress and low positivity, aloof, detached, mistrustful, hypersensitive, hyperactive. So now to high top. You've seen the high top figure. This is the full figure from a general psychopathology P factor at the top to individual signs, symptoms, and maladaptive behaviors at the bottom. We're going to be focusing on the middle layer, cutting off the very top and bottom, focusing on the spectra, subfactors, and the homogeneous symptom components and maladaptive traits that are in this arena. So the high distress and low positivity, if you put that into a high top broadband spectra, gets you to the internalizing area of the high top. So this, one of the main domains, one of the main spectra of the high top hierarchy. If we add then low positivity, it adds the detachment domain over here. So we've got these elements to consider as well as these elements to consider. So putting those together, we've got internalizing and detachment. If we add the interpersonal relationships, we don't get anything new particularly. We get the aloof, detached, mistrustful, which also is part, whoops, I skipped the, also part of the detachment spectrum here. So trying to find where, oh, whoops, I got the wrong one. Suspiciousness is part of the detachment domain. So the interpersonal and the affective domains go together, picking up both internalizing and detachment. Turning to the hyperactive cognitive sensory processing, we have the somatic sensitivity and unusual thought processes, and this broadens out then from internalizing and detachment and pulls in thought disorder and somatic form. So you can see the high top actually is quite well arranged in that it starts here, she had a little here, but it's really all together. There was a great question in the Q&A about why detachment is off over here rather than part of internalizing. And I think that is something that we are actually looking at, and that perhaps switching these two so that detachment is closer. The reason that it's here currently is that much of detachment grew out of the negative symptoms of psychosis with the flattened affect and so on. So detachment kind of has those two different arms. It's got more of an internalizing flavor and it's got more of a thought disorder flavor. So maybe it should be in between to reflect that that sort of dual nature of it. So these are the broadband spectra of the client's difficulties in high top terms. If we simplify it, the affective dimensions and interpersonal dimensions indicate the internalizing and detachment spectra, the hypersensitive, hyperactive somatic cognition, the somatoform and thought disorder spectrums. But we can also drill down into the subfactors and look at distress, fear, anxiety, eating pathology, mania, eccentricity. So we can get down to this level and see that the various more specific things about the client's psychopathology are addressed in high top. And if we go one more down to the component level, all of those internalizing and detachment spectra details are there. These are all from the client, whoops, all from the client's assessment that we do in a fairly standard kind of way, but they can all be organized into the internalizing and detachment spectra. Similarly with the somatoform and thought disorder spectra, these are all the client's different pieces, but they can all be found down here in the components of high top. If we look at zero in on just those components, you may be able to see a few of them. So there's the cognitive problems with somatoform, the negative relationships, here's panic, the dysphoria, lassitude, anxiousness, the suicidality, the GAD, low well-being, and then the hypomanic activation, hyperactive cognition, the eccentricity and unusual beliefs and experience, and finally the anhedonia and intimacy. So the question then becomes, would you rather deal with all of these different putatively distinct disorder, or think of it in high top terms, where we've got internalizing and detachment with all of these components of sort of an integral part, and same thing with the thought disorder spectra. And I see I managed to use up all but 30 seconds of my time. So hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for questions, or we can take your questions in the chat or the Q&A and get back to you. And I want to thank you for your time and attention, and quit sharing at this point.
Hey, thank you, Leanna. So with that, will you pass it off to Dr. Nelson?
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute there. All right, let me share. Okay, there we go. All right, so my name is Brady Nelson. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at Stony Brook University. So today I'm going to be talking about our training clinic's recent integration of the high-top battery into our adult assessment cases, as well as a focus on 2 example case presentations. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight before getting into the case presentations, and none of this is going to be content that will be new at this point, but this did really heavily influence the way that we think about and utilize the high-top battery within our clinic. So the high-top battery provides a very comprehensive overview of psychopathology that can be discussed at both higher order and narrow levels. So at the higher order, you might talk about psychopathology at either, say, the spectra or subfactor level. But at a more narrow level, you might talk about it in terms of maladaptive traits and symptom components. Now, most of the measures that are included in the high-top battery were actually designed to measure either symptoms or traits and facets. And I'm going to talk about at least the CAT-PD in terms of traits and facets, although I know within the high-top model and how Len has talked about things, he's kind of distinguished them as kind of spectra and traits. So just I say traits and facets, you can also kind of substitute it with spectra and traits. So most of these measures were designed not necessarily to measure these higher order dimensions, but really to measure these symptoms and traits. And so any discussion of the higher order, say superspectra, spectra, or subfactors largely needs to be done based on your interpretation and integration of the measures. Now, the decision to focus on either higher order and or narrow levels might really depend on the client profile and or referral questions. So just as some hypothetical examples, in some cases, you might have clients that are presenting with more limited psychopathology. And so this might be someone who is presenting with a more focal depressive episode or a particular phobia. In this case, you might want to focus more on the maladaptive traits, facets, and or symptom components, as it'll be most relevant to that client. Now, in other cases, you might have clients who present with a variety of psychopathology with notable areas of greatest severity. And so in this case, you might end up highlighting particular spectra or subfactors, but also emphasize additional narrow features of their profile that might be at the trait or symptom component level. And there might also be clients who present with very broad comorbid psychopathology. And in this case, it might be best to conceptualize them at either the super spectra or the spectra level. Now, part of what I will be discussing today is how we have utilized the high-top battery in the context of adult assessment cases. And while it is included along with lots of other tools and measures, we really begin to use it very early on in the assessment process, which is pretty much after they complete a phone screen with clinic staff, but before we even do an intake interview. But as has already been mentioned, these are not intended to be diagnostic in and of themselves. And so we're using these to, again, develop hypotheses about these clients. And then we are going to collect other information that can verify our hypotheses across other data, including interviews, other self-report questionnaires, review of medical or psychological records, as well as observations. And so the key thing I want to emphasize is that the high-top battery, I think, is best used in combination of both quantitative and qualitative aspects of an individual's profile. Two final points I just wanted to raise. One is that episodic symptom components, or the presenting symptoms, might be the emphasis of what initially brings someone in for an evaluation or brings them into the clinic. What we have actually found is that the maladaptive personality traits can also be very relevant as well, and might help you to distinguish whether this is a more potentially recent onset, more time-limited set of psychological problems, as compared to someone who has been experiencing problems for longer periods of time that may become to be more trait-like. And then finally, as usual, culture and development should always be taken into consideration when interpreting and using the high-top measures. Okay, so within our training clinic, which is the Krasner Psychological Center, what we use is a slightly modified version of the high-top DAT. So to assess symptom components, we are using the IDAS-2, as well as the audit and the DUDIT. We also supplement it with the Barkley Adult ADHD Rating Scale, as we do get a lot of referrals for ADHD evaluations. And then to assess maladaptive traits and facets, we also administer the CAT-PD. Other aspects of the high-top DAT that were measured in Catherine Jonas's presentation, we do not administer just for the purposes of, they don't seem to be as relevant to the types of clients that we get into referred to our clinic. So what I'm going to be doing is going over two de-identified clients that came to the clinic for an adult assessment. I'm going to be presenting and primarily focusing on the high-top battery and the scales as opposed to the comprehensive evaluation, because I want to talk about how we would potentially use this information at a very early time point in the assessment process. And so I'm going to present to you some just very basic information, which might be the limited information a clinician is presented with about a prospective client, and then to talk about their high-top profile and how we might conceptualize and think about it. Okay, so client number one is a 22-year-old non-binary, assigned sex female, white undergraduate. They were referred for an evaluation because they recently withdrew from school due to exhaustion and feeling overwhelmed. And based on our brief phone screen, they reported a longstanding history of depression and anxiety that had an onset in childhood. They were also currently seeing a therapist weekly for CBT. So we had the client complete the high-top battery online. And what I'm going to show you next are going to be their scores and profile. I'm going to start with the symptom components, focusing on the IDAS-2 as well as the audit and the DUDIT. And so what I'm showing you on the left are the different IDAS-2 subscales organized conceptually according to subfactors of distress, fear. I'm calling it bipolar here in ADHD. And on the right are going to be their audit and their DUDIT scores with the recommended risk level cutoff. And so all of these are the scores on the graph are T-scores, again, with a mean of 50, standard deviation of 10. And what we tend to do is to use between 65 and 69 as being considered at risk or borderline, and 70 and above as being in the clinically significant range. So what you can see with this particular client is that they are reporting elevations across a number of distress symptom components, including at-risk dysphoria, lassitude, low well-being, as well as clinically significant appetite loss. Now, in the fear subfactor, they are reporting at-risk social anxiety coupled with clinically significant checking and cleanliness. And there were no elevations on bipolar or ADHD symptom components. Across the substance use measures, they sort of zero on both the audit and the DUDIT. And so we primarily use the raw scores of the audit and the DUDIT and the recommended cutoff, not necessarily for diagnostic purposes, but to inform us whether we need to do a more in-depth thorough evaluation of drug and alcohol use. Okay, so with this client, based on symptoms in the last 2 weeks, we are seeing some at-risk and clinically significant symptom components across distress and fear. Now we're going to look at their CAT-PD. And so with the CAT-PD on the left, what I'm going to show you is actually going to be the higher order traits, which again, Len referred to as spectra. And then on the right, I'm going to show you the lower order facets that make up each of those traits. And so what you can see is that across the higher order traits, or again, the spectra, you really only see one that is really kind of close to the at-risk range, and that is with detachment. Now, when we look at the more lower order traits, what you'll actually see, there are a number that actually are in both the at-risk and the clinically significant range. And these are primarily within the negative emotionality and detachment spectra. And so they are reporting clinically significant anxiousness and depressiveness, as well as at-risk health anxiety, and clinically significant anhedonia with at-risk romantic disinterest and social withdrawal. So what's interesting here is, despite the fact that on the last 2 weeks measure from the IDAS, they are reporting some depressive symptomatology that is in the at-risk range, when they're asked other questions that are getting at more trait-like aspects of psychopathology, we see clinically significant traits across depressiveness and anhedonia. Now, the HiTOP DAT comes with a very nice manual that has descriptions for each of these scales. So I'm not going to sit and read these because you can read them on your own. But the point is to emphasize that within this client, you could use these descriptions to think about them at both a current symptomatology level, primarily emphasized here by appetite gain and OCD-like symptoms, as well as the spectra and trait level, primarily focusing on anxiousness, depressiveness, and anhedonia. So with a client like this, from a HiTOP perspective, we could think about them and describe them at a maladaptive trait level as being characterized by depressiveness, anhedonia, and anxiousness. But we can also emphasize at the symptom component level, the checking and the cleanliness symptom components. And so this client completed then a more thorough adult assessment evaluation. And as we do with all evaluations, we still at the end give them a DSM-5 ICD-10 diagnosis. And so what this client ended up receiving as diagnoses were major depressive disorder, recurrent severe, as well as generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And so you can see across the HiTOP traits and symptom components that they do represent the dimensional features that seem to be core aspects of these DSM diagnoses. Okay, so just for one other case example, this was a 22-year-old female biracial undergraduate. She presented to the clinic because she was having difficulties with attention, concentration, motivation, and time management. And she had questions about whether she may have ADHD. She also reporting a long-standing history of depression and anxiety with the childhood onset, but she had no history of other psychological evaluations or treatment. So this is what her profile looks like across the INS2, the audit, and the DUDIT. And so what you will see is that across all the subfactors, including distress, fear, bipolar, and ADHD, there were a number of both at-risk and clinically significant symptom components. In fact, across distress, there's clinically significant dysphoria, lassitude, insomnia, appetite gain, suicidality, ill temper, and traumatic intrusions and panic. Across fear, we see clinically significant social anxiety, cleanliness and orderliness. There is even clinically significant mania and at-risk inattentive symptoms from the ADHD, from the BARS. Now, across the audit and the DUDIT, this client was reporting drinking and drug use that was in the, and I would call the low risk, but potentially problematic range. And so these were additional areas that required further evaluation. Now, when we looked at their CAT-PD profile, what we see is some continuity between what we are assessing with the IDAS as well as what we can assess with the CAT-PD. And so at the spectra level, you'll see that they actually had negative emotionality scores that were in the clinically significant range. And this becomes obvious when you look at the lower order indicators of that in terms of affective ability, anger, and so on. Nearly all of them are in the clinically significant range with the exception of health anxiety. Now, while none of the other spectra were in the at-risk or clinically significant range, within 3 of the other 4 spectra, you do see some lower order traits that were in the clinically significant range, including anhedonia, emotional detachment, non-perseverance, and peculiarity. So this is a client that is reporting both clinically significant symptomatology within the last 2 weeks, as well as both spectra and trait level maladaptive personality pathology across a number of different domains. And so with a client like this, from a high-top perspective, we could describe them at a number of different levels. So at the spectra level, we might think about them as having clinically significant internalizing psychopathology. At the subfactor level, we might emphasize that they seem to present with primarily distress and fear psychopathology, although you could possibly also make a case for including a mania and thought disorder in there as well. Now, at the maladaptive trait level, nearly all aspects of negative emotionality were elevated, plus particular facets or lower traits from detachment, disinhibition, and psychoticism. And at the symptom component levels, they had multiple distress and fear symptom components, plus mania, as well as inattention. So, you know, I don't think there's necessarily a right way to conceptualize and integrate this all together. Given that some of the information across different levels does overlap with each other, the way that we decided to largely conceptualize this was someone who's presenting with significant internalizing psychopathology, as well as some externalizing disinhibition, primarily characterized by non-perseverance as well as inattention. And so based on the comprehensive evaluation, this individual ended up receiving DSM diagnoses of bipolar II disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and ADHD inattentive presentation. But you can see how several of those disorders may really be better represented and captured by some of these higher order dimensions and levels that there is really lots of elevation across many different measures. So I just want to end with recommendations for how you might think about providing this type of feedback to a client. Much of this is probably going to be information that is already quite obvious and relevant to what you do. But this is just based on our early experience of integrating this measure into adult assessment cases and then providing feedback to those clients. So one is in the context of a measure like this, when we're using T-scores, it's always helpful to explain to a client what a T-score means. They can be confused at times, I think, regarding, you know, what is important, what's not important, what's elevated, what's not elevated. So we tend to emphasize describing what a T-score is and to talk about these as being dimensional measures. What seems to work best is to focus more on patterns as opposed to explaining every score. So as an example, with the second client, there would be a lot of scales to potentially review with them. And I'm not saying you can't do that or shouldn't do that, but when you see lots of elevation, knowing that you may be emphasizing kind of higher order dimensions, it may be better to focus more on patterns as opposed to going through score by score. We found that this can be very useful for validating what clients are reporting in a very unstructured interview or based on your observations. So clients are coming in and telling us what they're able to tell us, and we're able to validate, you know, these clinical concerns based on these types of measures. It also is really helpful to highlight other areas that might initially be ignored or not discussed. So again, with the second client that I presented, this was initially a referral for a suspected ADHD. And as you can tell, there was a lot of other psychopathology that became really relevant to their profile and their presentation that may have been overlooked had we just focused in on just evaluating ADHD. From a conceptualization perspective, I do think it's important to at times distinguish between the trait and the duration specific measures. I found that at times this can be helpful in getting an early insight into whether someone might be presenting with possibly more new onset or time limited psychopathology as opposed to more chronic or long-standing psychopathology, which might have more important implications, not only for conceptualization and diagnosis, but also treatment. And as usual, it's helpful to not avoid discussion of challenging areas, particularly when assessing things like psychoticism and antagonism, and to make sure that those are discussed as part of conceptualization and feedback for that client. Okay, so I think that is the end for me, and I hope that leaves us time for some questions.
Hey, thanks, Brady. Yeah, I do think we have time for a few questions. So there were a few that came in through the Q&A. I wasn't able to monitor that without disrupting the presentation. Let's see, there was a question about ASD's symptom placement within high top structure and whether you could elaborate on that. I think you're muted, Leanna. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. We are in the process of looking at essentially every symptom in the DSM, so we can categorize a wider variety of types of psychopathology in the entire high top. I see ASD in a couple of different areas, definitely in detachment. Would be one area, and depending upon the particular person's clinical profile, it might also be in somatoform, and certainly there's elements of thought disorder. So it's not a unitary diagnosis that would fit into one particular spot. That's, again, in some ways a strength, and some people would say a weakness of high top, is that it breaks apart DSM disorders into their different components. But I would look first in detachment. I think that would be its primary home.
I can just say one thing based on some clients that have been referred to us for autism evaluations, in addition to some of the other things that I covered. What we have tended to do is we actually supplement this evaluation with a more in-depth evaluation of autism spectrum pathology. So it might start with something more basic in terms of a self-report or a parent report, SRS2 or SCQ. But if there is suspicion that autism may play a role in their presentation, we actually supplement the evaluation with an ADOS2. Which is, a very specialized assessment and time consuming, but we do have the capability of doing that.
Yeah, that's the one where I said that we refer out. There's a local clinic that does that. We don't do it ourselves because we're a very small operation, not connected with the medical school or anything. It's just me.
And there's a question about scoring the measures that came in during the previous talk. And just because Catherine's not here to answer that, I can answer for her. And that if you email her, she can send you either a Qualtrics or a REDCap version of the scales that automatically scores them and provides you with a printout of the scores. So it's really pretty easy to do for clinicians and for students working with them.
As well as the normed scores too, which is really helpful for clinical cases. And so you do get the T-scores based on the scoring tool.
The other questions also came in during the previous talk, but I think they're relevant here too. So maybe we can give that a try. There's a question of, are there other empirically supported psychological constructs like traits, processes, function states not currently specified in the high top model that show promise to enrich the model if added? For example, specific executive and cognitive functions, temperament, regularity, sensory threshold, theory of mind, and so on.
Yeah, definitely, and as I said, we're in the process, particularly led by Mary Forbes, working on examining where the entire set of DSM-5 symptoms fits. There's a process also for revision of the HiTOP model. One of the issues is, at this point, is the requirement of a firm empirical basis for addition. So we don't just add things by saying, I think theory of mind fits here. But yeah, definitely there are a number of things in the works. What were some of the specific ones again, David, that you mentioned?
Let me see here.
I know the sensory was one, and that would go under somatoform.
Regularity, theory of mind, literality.
Yeah, and anybody who wants to propose an addition to HiTOP, there is a process for that. If you get on the, I imagine if you get on the HiTOP website, I'm actually not sure where the form is, but if you have data that would suggest that a particular measure or a particular construct would fit in a particular place in the HiTOP model, or that the HiTOP model needs some revision in order to include something, we have a process for that, and really want HiTOP to be a living document and not a static form that only gets changed once every 15 years, like some other nosologies that we know, but that it's responsive to data. So yes, nothing imminent, I should say, but yes, in the works.
Yeah, and anyone can suggest a change to the model. It doesn't have to
Right.
be someone affiliated with HiTOP in any way.
Absolutely.
We encourage that from anyone who's interested.
Absolutely.
Another question that might be relevant here is in a clinical setting, how would you suggest balancing the elevations of certain HiTOP dimensions with the reason for seeking treatment and their presenting problem? In other words, how would you still incorporate the HiTOP dimensions into treatment if their primary concern for seeking treatment is largely unrelated?
We have not generally found that to be true, unless it's a issue of what I call the ticket and the target, which is that people often come in with their ticket in the door is, this is my presenting complaint, this is what I'm concerned about, but it's really just their ticket into the door. The real problem is something else. And so we have generally found that with a good feedback session after our assessment, the clients will often admit to the issues that were revealed on the assessment as being a major part of why they came in. But sometimes it's stigma. They don't want to say that. Sometimes it's fear that they have X, Y, or Z. So they present with something else to get assessed. But we try to explain that the assessment is nothing magic. They give us the information. We just organize it. And so when we feed it back to them, it resonates with clients and they can see it from our perspective. One example that I have recently, I actually don't remember what the presenting complaint was, but we found the person had a trauma history that she had not mentioned initially, and were able to tie a number of her current difficulties to this trauma history. And by the end of the feedback process, she had fully come around and was ready to jump into trauma-based treatment. And she said she was feeling better already as a result of the assessment and making sense of her experiences in terms of the trauma, which she had been trying not to do. She actually had been avoiding it. So that's been our experience.
I could give one just other experience on our end that seems to happen not frequently, but more frequently than not. And we do get a number of referrals for suspected ADHD are individuals who present with problems with attention concentration, memory, academic problems, present to the clinic, they have high average to superior, working memory and processing speed. They're reporting every ADHD symptom you can imagine, but they also have this long history of depression and crippling anxiety. And so it's very easy because we're still answering the referral question, which is why do I have these problems? What's contributing to my academic dysfunction? But we're doing through a lens that is more shades of gray and more comprehensive, as opposed to just saying to them, no, you don't have ADHD, which is sometimes what they think they're going to hear, but it's more about painting a more nuanced picture of what they might be experiencing.
Yeah, we have that exact same experience. And as I said, I would say about 15% of the time at most, they actually do show an attention problem and are able to use that through our disability services and get some accommodation. Most of the time, it's more concentration problems due to anxiety and depression.
Yep.
But you're right, that's a good way to reframe it, is that we are answering the referral question, just not in the way that they expected or wanted. And, most of the time, they're actually relieved. Occasionally, they'll be disappointed that we can't just refer them and they'll get a pill and everything will be better. We try to explain that, a lot of people would do better on a little bit of speed, but that's not a long-term solution to your problem.
Now, a question for Brady: How do you explain your assignment of both high-top and DSM diagnoses when giving feedback to clients?
Sure. So, we emphasize the kind of the quantitative aspects of their profile within the context of a descriptive narrative. So, we want to talk to them about that there are psychological profiles of which people have these things to different degrees. And that's kind of the primary way that we want them to think about what this evaluation can tell them. We also acknowledge that some of the world works in dichotomies and works with diagnoses. These might be necessary for accommodations, for reimbursement purposes, and so on. And so we provide these because they still are a part of the kind of medical model and technical terminology that people use. So to us, it provides an opportunity to say, you are not just someone who has depression. You have a number of features that are of clinical significance and relevance. But sometimes in certain situations, we need to come up with these diagnostic labels for these other purposes. And so, we try and connect them together so they can see how they're related, but to know that one might be used in one situation versus the other in a different situation.
Yeah, we do something very, very, very similar. And that's kind of what I was trying to show in my presentation, how high-top just rearranges things in a way that's actually simpler.
Yeah, and the high-top feedback has, I think, gone very well because it in many, not every, but in many cases, it really does validate to clients that I'm not making this up, I'm not crazy, no one believes me. We can validate this and to talk about, you do have a number of problems. Some of them are much more severe and more prominent. Others are also of relevance that maybe don't need to be the first line of attention. And it provides a much more nuanced picture as opposed to giving them 5 diagnoses and having them wonder, what does this mean for me?
Exactly.
Okay, well, we're a few minutes after 12 Eastern time, so we can end there for today and we'll pick up tomorrow morning. I'll save we didn't get to all the questions. I'll save those questions and pass them along to the presenters tomorrow. I think some of them can answer them. There were a couple of questions related to things like the IDOS and the CAT-PD. Len gave his contact information in his talk. I'll also pass that along either through email or through the chat tomorrow. They might be better questions for him to answer directly. And I just want to thank.
I'm happy to have my email shared too, Camilo. You have it. If you want to share that in the chat, that'd be great.
Me too.
In fact, someone already looked it up and sent me one email.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see everyone tomorrow morning.
Thanks for organizing.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.